There is a kingdom that ruled Scotland for 500 years, built extraordinary monuments, defeated the Roman Empire's greatest generals, and then simply vanished from the written record. Not conquered in any battle we can point to with certainty. Not swallowed by famine or plague or some catastrophe that left bones in the earth for us to count. The Picts ruled the north of Britain from roughly 300 CE until somewhere around 900 CE, and then the records stop. 5 centuries of kings, battles, alliances, stone monuments, intricate artwork, and a language nobody alive today can read. All of it disappearing into silence at the exact moment the Kingdom of Scotland begins to emerge. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The question is not simply where did the Picts go. The question is who removed them from the story, why they were removed, and what they knew and believed and built that someone found threatening enough to erase. Because civilizations do not vanish on their own, they are written out. They are absorbed and renamed, and their memory is managed by whoever inherits their land. And in the case of the Picts, the people who inherited the land had very good reasons to make sure that the version of history they wanted told was the version that survived. So, let us go back. Let us go back to a time before the silence, to the centuries when the Picts were not a mystery, but a living, breathing, politically sophisticated civilization that sat at the center of everything happening in early medieval Britain. A civilization with kings who negotiated with Northumbrian bishops and Viking jarls and Irish abbots all at once. A civilization with artists who produced some of the most technically complex and symbolically dense carved stones ever raised in Northern Europe. A civilization with a system of royal succession that was unique in the entire medieval world and that no one has ever satisfactorily explained. And then a civilization that, within the space of perhaps 2 generations, simply stops appearing in the record as itself. That is the mystery we are going to sit with tonight. Not to resolve it neatly, because the honest answer is that it cannot be resolved neatly, but to understand it properly, to understand what was actually lost and why that loss matters, and to trace the faint outlines of what the Picts were really doing in those centuries before the silence fell. We need to start with what people think they know about the Picts, because almost all of it is wrong. The popular image of the Picts is warriors, tattooed or painted savages charging Roman legions naked, screaming from the mist. That image comes almost entirely from Roman sources, and Roman sources about the peoples beyond Hadrian's Wall are about as reliable as a tourist brochure written by someone who has never visited the country being described. The Romans called them Picti, which most scholars interpret as meaning the painted or tattooed people, though some argue it simply meant the carved people, or even just the people beyond, a geographic description rather than an ethnic one. Either way, the Romans named them. The Picts almost certainly did not call themselves that. What they called themselves, in their own language, spoken in their own halls and markets and churches, we do not know. The word for it died with the language. And that is the first strange thing. The Picts left behind an enormous amount of physical evidence. Over 300 carved stones scattered across the landscape of eastern and northern Scotland from Shetland down to Fife. Some of them standing stones raised in open fields, some of them built into church walls, some of them found buried in bogs. They left behind the remains of hill forts and trading settlements and monasteries. They left behind extraordinary metalwork, silver chains and decorated bowls and brooches of such refinement that when they were first excavated, 19th century scholars initially refused to believe they were Scottish at all, because nothing they knew about the Picts suggested people capable of that level of artistry. They left behind traces in the place names of half of Scotland, the Aber prefix meaning river mouth, the Pit prefix meaning a share of land, the names of rivers and hills and headlands that still carry the ghost of a language spoken here for centuries. And yet, despite all of this physical presence, they left behind almost nothing written in their own hand about themselves. And what was written about them by others was written by people who had strong reasons to describe them in particular ways. The Irish annals mention the Picts. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention them. Bede, the Northumbrian monk who wrote his ecclesiastical history of the English people in the early 8th century, mentions them extensively and is one of our most important sources. But Bede was writing from the south, from a monastery in what is now northeast England, and he was writing with particular theological and political purposes that shaped everything he recorded. The Pictish king lists, Those catalogues of royal names and reigns that are the backbone of any attempt to reconstruct Pictish history survive in manuscripts that were copied in the 11th and 12th centuries, well after the Pictish kingdom had ceased to exist, and they were copied by scribes working in the kingdom that had replaced it. Those scribes had reasons of their own to arrange the past in certain ways, so the sources we have are fragmentary, mediated, politically motivated, and separated from the events they describe by generations of copying and editing. This is not unusual for early medieval history. This is early medieval history. What makes the Picts unusual is the degree of that fragmentation and the specific nature of what has been lost. Because what has been lost is not just detail. What has been lost is voice. Every other major group in early medieval Britain left behind texts in their own language. The Irish left behind the richest vernacular literature in early medieval Europe. The Anglo-Saxons left behind Beowulf and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and a vast body of legal texts and sermons and poetry. The Welsh left behind the Mabinogion and the early praise poetry of Aneurin and Taliesin. The Picts left behind almost nothing in their own words. A handful of inscriptions on stones, many of them in Ogham script, which is itself a form of writing borrowed from Irish tradition, and most of them either too short, or too weathered, or too linguistically opaque to yield clear meaning. That is all. This is not an accident, this is a pattern. And patterns in the historical record, especially patterns of absence, always mean something. Before we can understand the disappearance, we need to understand the thing that disappeared. The Picts were not a tribe. They were not a single ethnic group with a single culture and a single language and a single set of traditions. By the time the historical record begins to describe them with any detail, roughly from the 5th and 6th centuries onward, the Picts were a collection of kingdoms, sometimes united under a single overking and sometimes not, occupying most of what is now mainland Scotland, north of the Firth of Forth. The main groupings that appear in the sources include the people of Fortriu, who occupied the fertile ground around the Moray Firth and the Great Glen, and who were by far the most politically dominant Pictish group from the 7th century onward, the people of Say, who seem to have lived in Aberdeenshire, the people of Sursin, whose territory included Angus, and the Mearns, the people of Fib, who occupied Fife, and various groups further north, including the people of Cat, which is the ancestor of the modern county name Caithness, and the people of Orse, whose territory covered what is now the county of Orkney. Each of these groups had its own internal political structures, its own local traditions, its own relationship to the overarching Pictish identity that Romans and Irish and Northumbrians observed from the outside. The degree to which these groups thought of themselves as a single people, as Picts in any meaningful collective sense, is genuinely unclear. What we can say is that there was enough shared culture and enough shared political organization at various points to allow the emergence of figures who could claim authority across much or all of this territory, and that the symbols carved on the stones appear across all of these regions in ways that suggest a shared symbolic vocabulary, even if the specific meaning of that vocabulary is lost. And those symbols are where things start to get deeply strange. If you have ever seen a Pictish symbol stone, you will know the feeling of looking at something that is clearly communicating, that is clearly dense with intentional meaning, while being completely unable to understand what it is saying. The symbols are not letters. They are not a written language in any sense we recognize. They are a visual system, a set of recurring images that appear in consistent combinations on stones raised across centuries and across hundreds of miles of Scottish landscape. There are around 50 or 60 distinct symbols that researchers have identified, and they fall into rough categories. There are the geometric symbols, the double disc and Z-rod, the crescent and V-rod, the rectangle, the flower, the mirror, the comb. There are the animal symbols, the eagle, the salmon, the boar, the serpent, the horse, the bull. There are more complex composite symbols like the Pictish beast, which is a serpentine animal unlike anything in the natural world, with a beaked snout and spiraling tail and fins or curling legs. One of the most frequently occurring and most enigmatic images in the entire corpus. The symbols appear in pairs or in combinations, almost always in the same orientation, almost always following conventions that were clearly understood by whoever commissioned and carved the stones. On the class I stones, the earliest group, the symbols are incised directly onto undressed natural rock faces. On the Class II stones, which postdate the conversion to Christianity and are therefore later, the symbols share the stone with a carved cross, and sometimes with figural scenes of battles or hunts or religious imagery. On the Class III stones, the symbols sometimes disappear entirely, replaced by purely Christian iconography, which is itself a significant fact about the trajectory of Pictish culture over those centuries. The paired nature of the symbols has led many researchers to conclude that they represent something like a naming system, a way of identifying individuals through the combination of two heraldic-type emblems. Perhaps the double disc and Z-rod paired with the eagle identifies a specific person or a specific family or lineage. Perhaps the crescent and V-rod paired with the salmon identifies another. If that is right, then the stones are not simply decorative or devotional objects. They are memorials, markers of specific individuals whose identity is being communicated to everyone in the community who passes by and who understands the visual code. They are saying, in a language that only the people who lived within that culture could read, this is who is remembered here. This is whose territory this marks. This is the lineage that claims this land. But we are outside that culture. We are separated from it by 1,200 years and by the deliberate or incidental loss of the interpretive tradition that would have made those symbols legible. So we look at the stones and we see extraordinary craftsmanship, and we feel the presence of meaning without being able to access it, which is perhaps the most accurate metaphor for the Pictish experience in general. Something is there, something significant and sophisticated and human, and we cannot quite reach it. The efforts to decode the symbols have been going on since the 19th century, and they have not converged on any consensus. Some scholars argue they represent a proto-heraldic system of the kind I described, recording lineage and identity for people who passed by. Some argue they encode a calendrical or astronomical system, tracking the movements of celestial bodies in a landscape where knowing the seasons was a matter of survival. Some argue they are magical or religious symbols with apotropaic power, placed on stones to invoke protection or connection with supernatural forces. Some argue they record property rights or territorial claims. Some argue a combination of all of these things simultaneously, because there is no reason a symbol system cannot be doing several things at once. The honest position is that we do not know, and that not knowing is itself a form of knowledge about the situation we are in with the Picts. They were communicating. We cannot hear them. What we can observe is the sophistication of the communication. The symbols are not crude or haphazard. They are produced with remarkable consistency across huge geographic distances and across centuries of time, which means there was a tradition behind them, a craft tradition, an artistic tradition, possibly a professional class of people whose role it was to produce these symbols correctly and who trained their successors in how to do so. The precision of the incising, the careful proportioning of the images, the way elements are arranged on the stone surface to create visual balance and flow, all of this speaks to a high level of artistic training and to a culture that valued visual communication enough to invest significant resources in it. These are not the marks of illiterate savages. These are the marks of a civilization with aesthetic standards and symbolic depth. And then there is the question of the Class II stones, the stones that combine Pictish symbols with Christian imagery, and what those stones tell us about the relationship between Pictish tradition and the Christianity that was spreading through Scotland in the 6th and 7th centuries. The Pictish conversion to Christianity is usually dated to somewhere around 565 CE, when the Irish monk Columba, working from his monastery on the island of Iona, visited the Pictish king Bride mac Maelchon at his fortress near Inverness, and reportedly performed a series of miracles. This story comes from a Domnan's life of Columba, written about a century after the events it describes, and it has the shape of hagiography, a saint's biography, rather than neutral historical reportage. The miracles are there to demonstrate Columba's holiness. The king's response is there to show the power of the Christian God over the pagan north. The political and diplomatic realities behind the visit, the questions of why Bride received Columba, what Columba offered him, what Bride got in return for allowing Christian missionaries into his territory, those things are not the story a Domnan was interested in telling. What we can say is that over the course of the late 6th and 7th centuries, Christianity spread through Pictish territory, that Pictish kings began using Latin titles and corresponding with continental church figures, that monasteries were founded in Pictish lands, and that the Pictish symbol stones began to incorporate Christian imagery in ways that are visually extraordinary. The cross that appears on the Class II stones is not a simple cross. It is a full slab carved in high relief, with intricate knotwork and spirals and animal interlace that draws on both the Celtic Christian artistic tradition coming from Iona and on something distinctly Pictish, something in the handling of the animal forms and the geometric patterns that does not appear in Irish or Northumbrian art in quite the same way. The Pictish artists took Christianity and filtered it through their own visual tradition and produced something that was neither simply Columban nor simply Pictish, but a synthesis, and that synthesis is one of the most visually striking achievements of early medieval European art. But the coexistence of the Pictish symbols and the Christian cross on the same stone also raises a question that has not been satisfactorily answered. What was the relationship between the symbol system and Christianity? Did the Pictish symbols represent a pre-Christian religious or cosmological tradition that was gradually displaced as Christianity became more dominant, which would explain their disappearance from the Class III stones? Or were the symbols essentially secular, a social and political communication system that coexisted with Christianity because it was doing a different kind of work? Or was there a Pictish version of Christianity that integrated the symbols into its devotional practice in ways we no longer understand, so that the symbol stones were always in some sense sacred objects even after the conversion? We cannot answer this question. The people who could have answered it, the Pictish clergy and scholars and artists who inhabited those monasteries and raised those stones, did not leave behind the texts that would tell us. Or if they did leave behind those texts did not survive. And again, the absence is not random, it is patterned. It concentrates precisely in the areas where understanding Pictish identity and Pictish tradition in their own terms would be most illuminating and most politically inconvenient for whoever came after. Now let us talk about the thing that most confounds modern historians and that most clearly demonstrates that the Picts were operating according to social rules fundamentally different from their neighbours. Let us talk about how they decided who got to be king. In virtually every other early medieval kingdom we know of, royal succession worked through the male line. A king's son inherited. If there was no son, a brother, a nephew through the male line, some male relative traceable back to the founding royal ancestor through fathers and grandfathers. This was the rule across the Irish kingdoms, across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, across the Frankish Empire, across the Viking world. It was not always smooth or uncontested, but it was the organizing principle. Sons inherited from fathers. In the Pictish king lists, this principle is violated over and over again in a pattern that is too consistent to be accidental and too strange to be easily explained. When you look at the succession of Pictish kings across several centuries, what you find repeatedly is that the successor is not the son of the previous king, but rather a figure whose relationship to the kingship appears to run through his mother. Brothers succeed brothers. Then the kingship passes not to the next brother's son, but to the son of a sister, or to someone whose claim appears to derive from a woman connected to the royal line rather than from a man. There are cases in the Pictish king lists where the same name appears in two different generations, where a king is recorded with a father whose name identifies him as coming from a different people entirely, Irish, or Dalriadan, or even Northumbrian, while still claiming and exercising Pictish kingship. What these anomalies suggest, and what several generations of scholars have argued with varying degrees of confidence, is that Pictish royal succession was matrilineal, that the right to rule passed through women. Bede himself comments on this, and his testimony is striking precisely because he finds it so unusual. He writes, as Bede records, that when the Picts needed a king, they chose from the female royal line rather than the male, and he regards this as sufficiently strange to be worth noting as a custom specific to this people. Now, Bede's description is not entirely reliable, because Bede is interpreting a foreign custom through his own cultural framework, and he may be oversimplifying something more complex. But the king list evidence, fragmentary as it is, does support the idea that there was something genuinely unusual about Pictish succession, something that made the female line important in a way it was not in neighbouring kingdoms. What would a matrilineal succession system mean in practice? It would mean that the women of the royal line were extraordinarily valuable politically, not as passive carriers of dynastic claims, but as the actual conduits of royal legitimacy. A Pictish princess marrying a king from another people would not simply be forming an alliance. She would be giving that king's sons the possibility of Pictish kingship, provided those sons could claim their Pictish identity through her. This would make the management of royal women's marriages a matter of fundamental political importance. It would mean that a foreign king who married a Pictish princess and whose son then inherited Pictish kingship would not be an outsider imposing foreign rule. He would be exercising a claim that the Pictish system itself had generated. The legitimacy would be real, by the rules of the system, even if the resulting king had an Irish name and Irish training and Irish political connections. This has enormous implications for understanding Kenneth MacAlpin, the figure who is traditionally credited with uniting the Picts and the Scots of Dalriada and founding the Kingdom of Alba, which eventually became Scotland. Kenneth is in most accounts treated as a conqueror, a Gaelic king who defeated the Picts and absorbed their kingdom into his own. But there is another reading. There is a reading in which Kenneth had a legitimate claim to Pictish kingship through his mother or through a Pictish woman in his lineage, and in which his exercise of that claim was recognized as legitimate under the Pictish system itself. Whatever the violence and disruption that may have accompanied it, whether that reading is correct is disputed, but it matters enormously for how we understand what happened to the Picts, because if Kenneth's kingship was legitimate by Pictish standards, then what happened was not conquest and erasure, it was succession, and if it was succession, then the question of why Pictish identity disappeared becomes much more complex than a simple story of military defeat. The Pictish language is another frontier of the mystery. We know it existed. We know people spoke it in the lands east and north of the Forth for centuries. We have a handful of inscriptions, most of them very short, most of them in Ogham script, a handful of them in the Latin alphabet, and we have some names, place names and personal names that appear in the written record that are identifiably Pictish rather than Gaelic or Brythonic or Latin. And from these fragments, scholars have been arguing for over a century about what kind of language Pictish actually was. The two main positions are these. One position holds that Pictish was a Brittonic Celtic language, closely related to the Brythonic family that includes Welsh and Cornish and the extinct languages of the ancient Britons. On this view, Pictish was not radically different from the other P-Celtic languages spoken in Britain at the same period. It was perhaps a distinct dialect or branch, but it was within the same family, understandable with effort by Welsh or Cumbric speakers, using the same basic grammatical structures and a largely shared vocabulary. The place name evidence tends to support this position because many Pictish place names show the same patterns of formation as Welsh and Brythonic names, using elements that are clearly Celtic in origin. The other position holds that Pictish was not, or not entirely, an Indo-European language, that embedded within the Pictish linguistic record there are elements that do not fit the Celtic template, that suggest some layer of pre-Indo-European language surviving in northern Britain into the historical period. This more radical position was championed in the early 20th century and has been contested ever since. The main evidence for it is a group of inscriptions, particularly some of the longer Ogham texts from Shetland and the Northern Isles, that resist interpretation through any known Celtic vocabulary and seem to follow grammatical patterns that do not map onto Celtic morphology. If these inscriptions are genuinely Pictish, rather than some other kind of text, they suggest that Pictish was doing something linguistically that Celtic languages do not do. The honest assessment of the current state of scholarship is that the debate is unresolved and that the evidence base is too thin to resolve it definitively. We have too few texts. The texts we have are too short. The names we have are subject to multiple interpretive frameworks. What we can say is that Pictish was distinctive enough that Irish and Northumbrian commentators noted it as a separate language, not simply a dialect of something they already knew. And that distinctiveness, whatever its ultimate linguistic character, was part of what made the Picts a coherent cultural identity. When the language ceased to be used, when Gaelic replaced it as the prestige language of the emerging Scottish kingdom, something fundamental about Pictish identity went with it. Language is not merely a medium of communication. It is a carrier of the conceptual categories, the metaphors, the ways of dividing up experience that make one culture distinct from another. When Pictish died, The Pictish way of organizing the world died with it. And now let us stand before one of the stones that the Picts actually left behind, because to talk about them in the abstract is to miss the immediate, physical reality of what they made and what that making tells us. The Aberlemno stones stand in a churchyard in Angus, in the eastern lowlands of Scotland, and they have stood there for over 1,000 years. There are 4 stones at Aberlemno, and the most famous of them, the one that stops people in their tracks, is a Class 2 slab, standing roughly 2.5 meters tall, with a carved cross on one face, and on the other face, a battle scene that is one of the most detailed and most discussed images in Pictish art. The battle scene on the back of the Aberlemno churchyard stone shows warriors on horseback and on foot, engaging in what is clearly organized combat. There are figures fleeing, figures pursuing, figures with weapons raised, and in one corner a figure that appears to be dead with a raven landing on the body. The warriors are shown wearing distinctive equipment, helmets and chainmail, and carrying weapons, and some of them carry a distinctive style of rectangular shield, while others have a different type. The reason this stone has attracted so much scholarly attention is the possibility, seriously entertained by a number of researchers, that it records a specific historical event. In 685 CE, at a place called Nectansmere or Dunnechtain, a Pictish army under King Bridie Mac Bail defeated and killed Ecgfrith, king of Northumbria, ending what had been an increasingly aggressive Northumbrian expansion into Pictish territory. This battle was one of the most consequential military events in early medieval Britain. It effectively set the northern boundary of Northumbrian power and ensured that the Pictish heartland remained outside Northumbrian political control. It is the kind of event that a people would want to commemorate. Some researchers have argued that the battle scene on the Aberlemno stone is that commemoration, that the different types of warriors depicted correspond to the Pictish and Northumbrian armies, that the fleeing figures are the retreating Northumbrians, and that the dead figure with the raven is Ecgfrith himself. If that reading is correct, and it has been challenged as well as supported, then the Aberlemno stone is not simply a religious or commemorative monument in a general sense. It is a specific historical document, a visual record of a named battle and a named victory, carved in stone by people who were present or who knew people who were present, and raised in a location that would have been seen by everyone in the community as a permanent declaration of Pictish power and Pictish memory. This is important because it changes how we think about the Picts, a people who commission narrative battle scenes, recording specific military victories, are not a people without historical consciousness. They are a people with a sophisticated sense of how history works and how memory is maintained, and why particular moments need to be fixed in permanent form. They understood that what is not remembered is lost. They were trying not to be lost. And yet here we are, 1,200 years later, unable to read the language in which their most important monument is written. Now stand before another stone, this one further north, this one so large and so complex that it seems almost impossible that it was raised by early medieval craftsmen working with iron tools and human muscle alone. Sueno's stone stands near the town of Forres in Moray, and it stands nearly 6.5 meters tall, which makes it the largest carved Pictish monument in existence. It was buried for centuries, which is partly why it has survived at all, because those buried centuries protected it from weathering. When it was raised again, what emerged was a surface covered almost entirely with carved figures, hundreds of them, arranged in registers one above another like the panels of a graphic narrative. The scene depicted covers both major faces of the stone and shows what appears to be a massive military conflict followed by its aftermath, including headless bodies arranged in rows and decapitated heads displayed separately, which suggests either a battle and its aftermath, or perhaps an execution scene on a scale that implies royal power exercising itself with extreme violence. The precise event that Sueno's stone records, if it records a specific event at all, is unknown. There are several theories. Some researchers have connected it to the campaigns of Constantine II in the early 10th century, the last Pictish king, or one of the last, fighting against Viking incursion. Others have connected it to earlier conflicts, to the wars between Fortriu and the Dalriadan Scots, or to battles with Northumbria. The stone has been dated on stylistic grounds to somewhere in the 9th or 10th century, which places it right in the middle of the period of Pictish collapse. If it is recording a real event from that period, it may be the last major commemorative monument raised in the Pictish tradition, a final statement of Pictish historical consciousness made at precisely the moment that consciousness was about to be extinguished. There is something almost unbearable about that possibility. The idea that the people who raised Sweno's stone were commemorating a victory or marking a catastrophe, while the tradition of raising such stones was ending around them. That the craftsmen who carved those hundreds of figures in that extraordinary detail were among the last people who knew how to do what they were doing and who understood what it meant. That within a generation or two of Sweno's stone being raised, no one would raise another stone in this tradition. The knowledge would not be passed on. The symbols would stop being carved. The visual language would fall silent, just as the spoken language was falling silent, just as the names and the ceremonies and the customs were being replaced by something new. And somewhere in that silence is the answer to the question we are asking. Not a simple answer, not a single event or a single decision that explains everything, but a process, a shift in the cultural and political weather that made being Pictish less useful and less survivable than being something else, and that made the memory of having been Pictish inconvenient for the people who came after. To understand that process, we need to understand what was happening in the decades before the silence. We need to understand the catastrophe of 839 CE. In that year, according to the Irish annals, a Viking army met a Pictish army in a battle somewhere in Pictish territory, possibly near the River Tay, and the result was a slaughter of the Pictish elite, so severe that it effectively decapitated the Pictish political leadership in a single engagement. The annals record the deaths of Ewan mac Oengus, king of Fortriu and the most powerful Pictish king of his generation, his brother Bran, and an extraordinary number of unnamed nobles and warriors. The number of dead was noted by Irish annalists as shocking even by the standards of a violent age. This was not simply a military defeat. This was a catastrophe of a kind that breaks the continuity of political institutions. When the people who know how the system works, who carry the institutional memory of how successions are managed, and alliances are maintained, and laws are administered, all die in a single battle, the system does not simply experience a setback. It loses the capacity to reproduce itself. The aftermath of 839 is a period of intense political instability in Pictish territory. The king lists for this period become confused and contradictory, with multiple claimants and very short reigns suggesting repeated violent succession disputes. Into this chaos, according to the traditional account, comes Kenneth mac Alpin, a king of the Gaelic Scots of Dalriada, who by 843 CE or thereabouts has established himself as king over the combined Pictish and Dalriadan territory. What exactly happened in those years between the disaster of 839 and Kenneth's consolidation of power is one of the great unsolved puzzles of early Scottish history. The later tradition, recorded in sources written centuries after the events, tells a story that is almost certainly legendary rather than historical in any strict sense. It speaks of a great treachery, of Kenneth inviting Pictish nobles to a feast and then having them killed, of a political massacre that eliminated the surviving Pictish leadership in a single stroke. This story appears in sources that are, at best, 3 centuries removed from the events they describe and that were written in a political context, the emerging Scottish kingdom, where there were strong reasons to emphasize the completeness and the legitimacy of the Gaelic takeover of Pictish territory. The feast treachery story may be entirely fictional. It may be a garbled memory of real events. It may be a conflation of different events from different periods. We cannot know. What we can say is that within a generation of Kenneth's establishment of power, the kingdom that emerges from the north of Britain is called Alba, not Pictland. Its kings bear Gaelic names. Its church is organized around the Columban tradition, rather than any distinctly Pictish ecclesiastical tradition. Its administrative language, insofar as it has one, is Latin and Gaelic. And the Picts, as a political identity, as a cultural category, as a name in the records, begin to fade. The speed of this fading has always been one of the most puzzling things about the Pictish disappearance. Within a century of Kenneth's reign, references to the Picts in contemporary sources become rare and then absent. This is extraordinary. Ethnic identities in the early medieval period did not usually vanish this quickly. The Britons of Strathclyde maintained their distinct identity for centuries after being incorporated into a kingdom dominated by others. The Welsh maintained Welsh identity under enormous political pressure for 1,000 years and are still maintaining it. The Cornish maintained Cornish identity through English conquest and English colonization. Why did the Picts not do the same? Part of the answer lies in the character of the Pictish political system itself. Because the Pictish identity was organized around kingship and royal succession in a way that was unusually centralized, the loss of independent Pictish kingship was uniquely destabilizing. When there was no longer a Pictish king, there was no longer a center around which Pictish political identity could organize. In the Irish world, where there were hundreds of petty kingdoms each with their own royal lineage, the elimination of any particular king did not eliminate Irish identity because Irish identity was not located in a single kingship. In the Pictish world, where the overking of Fort Triu had been the organizing principle of Pictish political life, the replacement of that overking with someone who was not Pictish and who had no interest in being Pictish pulled the center out of the structure. But that cannot be the whole explanation. People do not lose ethnic identity just because they lose a king. There must be other factors, and there are. The role of the church is one of them, and it is a role that has not always been given the attention it deserves. The church that operated in Pictish territory in the centuries before Kenneth MacAlpin was a complicated institution with roots in multiple traditions. There was the tradition coming from Iona and the Columban monasteries, which was Irish in origin and which operated in both Dalriadan Scots territory and in parts of Pictish territory, particularly in the west. There was a more indigenous Pictish ecclesiastical tradition centred on figures like Ninian of Wythorn and on sites in the Pictish heartland like Rosemarkie and Portmahomac, which appear to have had their own theological emphases and their own organisational structures. There were Northumbrian ecclesiastical influences in the south of Pictish territory, particularly after the Synod of Whitby in 664 CE aligned the Northumbrian church more closely with Roman practice. And there was the Roman tradition itself, which was gradually asserting greater organisational coherence over all the regional churches of Britain and Ireland through the 7th and 8th centuries. The monastery at Portmahomac, on the Tarbat Peninsula, in Easter Ross, has been excavated in recent decades and has produced extraordinary results. It was clearly a major scriptorium, an artistic centre, producing high-quality vellum manuscripts and elaborate carved stones, and its excavation has confirmed that there was a substantial Pictish ecclesiastical tradition with its own craft schools and intellectual life. And then at some point in the 9th century, Portmahomac was violently destroyed. The excavation found evidence of burning, of deliberate destruction, of the kind of damage that comes from organised violence rather than from accidental fire. The timing suggests Vikings, but the specific identity of the destroyers is not certain. What is certain is that after the destruction, Portmahomac was not rebuilt as a Pictish monastic centre. Whatever had been created there, whatever manuscripts had been written there, whatever traditions had been maintained there, were gone. The pattern at Portmahomac was repeated across Pictish ecclesiastical sites. The Viking raids that struck the monasteries and churches of northern and eastern Scotland in the 9th century destroyed not just buildings but institutional memory. Monks and scribes and teachers died or fled. Manuscripts burned. The chain of transmission through which Pictish ecclesiastical learning and Pictish literary culture would have been passed to future generations was broken at multiple points simultaneously. And when the institutions were rebuilt, they were rebuilt under the patronage of the new Gaelic kingship, in the Gaelic ecclesiastical tradition, with Gaelic clergy who had Gaelic priorities. The space that had once been occupied by whatever Pictish Christian intellectual culture had existed was now occupied by something different. This is not necessarily deliberate erasure in the sense of a calculated decision to destroy Pictish identity. It may be, in many cases, simply the consequence of institutional disruption and replacement. When old institutions die and new ones are built in their place, the new ones do not maintain the archives and the traditions of the old. They build their own. And if the old archives and traditions are already gone, destroyed by Vikings or by the chaos of political collapse, then there is nothing to maintain, even if the will to maintain it existed. But the will to maintain it may also not have existed. And here we enter more speculative territory, though speculative territory supported by a general understanding of how early medieval political legitimacy worked. Kenneth MacAlpin, and his successors needed to be kings of a unified kingdom. To be kings of a unified kingdom, they needed the people of that kingdom to have a shared identity that could recognize and support their authority. A kingdom half of whose population maintained a separate and prior ethnic identity organized around a royal tradition that the current king had displaced was a kingdom vulnerable to challenge and fragmentation. The smart political move, the move that every successful medieval state builder made in analogous situations, was to promote an identity that encompassed everyone while obscuring the distinctions between the constituent groups. In the case of the emerging kingdom of Alba, that meant promoting the idea that everyone in the kingdom, north of the Forth, was part of a single Gaelic-inflected identity, that the distinctions between Gael and Pict were historical curiosities rather than living cultural realities, that the new kingdom had always been the natural political unit of this territory. This is how ethnic identities get managed out of existence in the early medieval period. Not through massacres, necessarily, though those happened too, but through the management of prestige, through the control of which language gets used in which contexts, through the patronage of ecclesiastical institutions that teach and transmit a particular cultural framework, through the recording of history in ways that emphasize continuity and coherence rather than disruption and difference. The people of Pictish descent did not disappear from the land. They stayed where they were. They continued farming and fishing and raising children. But the cultural framework through which they understood themselves, the symbols and the language and the royal tradition and the ecclesiastical identity that had made them Picts rather than something else, that framework was no longer being reproduced. The institutions that maintained it were gone. The prestige language was someone else's language now. The kings were from someone else's tradition. The church was organized by someone else's clergy. And within 2 or 3 generations, the people whose grandparents had been Picts were simply people who lived in Alba, who spoke Gaelic because that was the language of power and commerce and religion, who identified with the new kingdom because the new kingdom was what existed. This is a human process, not a magical one. It happens in the historical record again and again. It happened to the Normans in England, who were speaking English within 3 generations of the conquest. It happened to the Romans in Britain, whose descendants became British Celts within a century or 2 of the legion's withdrawal. It happened to the Vikings in Normandy, who were speaking French within 100 years of their settlement. In each case, the group that lost political and ecclesiastical dominance gradually lost cultural distinctiveness as well, not because they were eliminated, but because there was no longer a structure to maintain and reproduce their distinctiveness. The difference with the Picts is the speed and the completeness of the process, and the specific way in which the physical evidence of Pictish civilization, the symbol stones above all, was handled in the period after the kingdom's end. Some of the stones were incorporated into church walls or used as building material, which preserved them physically, but also removed them from their original context and original function. Some were left standing in fields, where they continued to mark the landscape even after their symbolic language was no longer understood. Some were buried, whether deliberately to protect them or as part of clearance of earlier sacred sites for Christian use. The symbol tradition itself simply ended. The last symbol stones were carved sometime in the 9th or 10th century, and then no more were carved. The people who knew how to carve them and who understood what the symbols meant either died or moved, or simply stopped, because the cultural context that had given the symbols their meaning no longer existed. And when later generations in the emerging Scottish kingdom looked at these stones, they did not read them as records of their own ancestors' civilization. They read them as mysterious objects from a mysterious past, from people who were not quite the same as themselves. The Picts had already been othered, already been made into something foreign and exotic, within the first generation or 2 of the kingdom of Alba. The process of making them into a mystery, rather than a memory, had already begun. Let us now do something that the written sources largely do not allow us to do. Let us look at how Pictish people actually lived. Not the kings and their battles, not the ecclesiastical politics and the succession disputes, but the daily reality of existence in the Pictish world. Because there is a tendency, when dealing with a civilization that is known primarily through its monuments and its wars, to think of that civilization as made entirely of monuments and wars. The Picts become, in the popular imagination, a people of stones and swords, But they were also a people who ate and slept and traded and farmed and raised children and made jokes and fell in love and got sick and grew old. They were people, in the full sense. And archaeology, more than any written source, brings us close to that reality. The Fortriu heartland, the area around the Moray Firth, and the great glen that was the political centre of Pictish power from at least the 7th century onward, has been the subject of intensive archaeological investigation over the past several decades. And what has emerged from that investigation is a picture substantially more complex and more prosperous than the older scholarship suggested. The Picts were not subsistence farmers scratching a living from poor northern soils. They were an agricultural people with a diverse and productive economy, with long-distance trade connections, with specialized craft production, and with a settlement hierarchy ranging from dispersed farmsteads to large enclosed settlements that functioned as political and economic centers. The royal sites, the places where Pictish kings held court and exercised authority, were substantial complexes rather than simple fortified hilltops. Craig Fadrig, near Inverness, traditionally identified as the site of Brydei Mac Maelchon's fortress, the one that Columba supposedly visited in 565 CE, sits on a prominent hill with a commanding view over the Moray Firth and the approaches to the Great Glen. The ramparts of the fort, built from timber and stone in the vitrified construction technique found at many Iron Age and early medieval sites in Scotland, enclose a substantial interior space. Burghead, on the southern shore of the Moray Firth, is a promontory fort of extraordinary size and elaboration, one of the largest Pictish fortified sites known, with multiple lines of rampart and evidence of occupation spanning several centuries. Within the Burghead complex, archaeologists have found remarkable evidence of Pictish religious or ceremonial practice, including a well or cistern that appears to have been used for ritual purposes, with carved bull symbols on the stones surrounding it. Over 30 carved bull stones have been recovered from Burghead, making it by far the richest site for a single Pictish symbol, and leading to speculation that the bull was the totemic symbol of whatever lineage or faction was dominant at Burghead during its period of use. The evidence for Pictish farming and food production fills out the picture further. Pollen analysis from sites across eastern Scotland shows the characteristic signature of intensive agriculture in the Pictish period, with cereal cultivation dominating the landscape, particularly oats and barley, which are the crops best suited to northern Scottish conditions. Animal bone assemblages from settlement sites show cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses, with cattle being the dominant domestic animal and a central element of the Pictish economy in ways that parallel their importance in the Irish and broader Celtic world. Cattle were wealth. They were the measure of value in a society that did not use coin for most transactions. They were the form in which tribute was paid, the medium through which political relationships were expressed, the currency of alliance and of insult. A Pictish king who could not maintain large herds was a king who could not maintain political power. A Pictish noble who lost cattle lost status in a way that was immediately legible to everyone around him. The fishbone and marine invertebrate remains from coastal Pictish sites tell a story of intensive exploitation of marine resources. The Picts were fishers and sea hunters on a substantial scale, and the access to the extraordinarily productive waters off the Scottish coast was a significant economic resource. Porpoise bones, whale bones, seal bones, alongside the remains of cod and haddock and herring, all appear in the archaeological record. The sea was not a boundary for the Picts. It was a road and a larder and a political space in which power was projected through maritime capabilities that the landlocked peoples to the south could not easily match. The evidence for Pictish craft production and trade is particularly striking. The metalwork that has come down to us from Pictish contexts is extraordinary in its technical quality and its artistic sophistication. The Norreys Law hoard, discovered in Fife in the 19th century, included silver objects decorated with Pictish symbols of a quality that could hold its own against any contemporary European metalwork. The Monymusk reliquary, a small house-shaped shrine made of wood and metal, covered with intricate decoration, is one of the finest small metal objects to survive from early medieval Britain, the street. Ninian's Isle treasure, a collection of silver objects found buried in the floor of a church on Shetland in 1958, is perhaps the most spectacular Pictish metalwork assemblage known. with bowls and brooches and hanging bowls and sword fittings of a quality that implies not just skilled craftsmen, but a sophisticated patronage system and access to significant quantities of silver as raw material. Silver does not come from Scotland in any significant quantity. The silver in Pictish metalwork came from somewhere else, through trade or through tribute or through raiding. The presence of high-quality silver in Pictish contexts implies that the Picts were participating in exchange networks that stretched well beyond their own territory, that they had things other people wanted and were able to acquire things they needed in return. What the Picts had that others wanted included cattle, furs, slaves, and perhaps the distinctive Pictish carved objects themselves, which appear to have been valued as prestige goods across early medieval Britain. The trading settlements are another dimension of Pictish economic life that archaeology has begun to illuminate. The site at Bursay on Orkney, which shows Pictish occupation before the Norse takeover, appears to have been a significant centre of trade and exchange. Port Mahomac, the monastic site we mentioned earlier, seems to have served as a production and distribution centre for high-value goods alongside its religious function, which is entirely consistent with how early medieval monasteries operated across the British Isles. The monasteries of the early medieval world were not simply places of prayer. They were economic powerhouses, centres of craft production, agricultural management, and long-distance trade, all conducted under the organisational umbrella of ecclesiastical authority. The settlement landscape of Pictish territory, as it is being revealed by aerial photography and LiDAR survey, shows a density of occupation that is striking. There are many more traces of Pictish settlement in the landscape than older scholarship assumed. Enclosed farmsteads, sutur structures, pit-defined enclosures, the traces of small-scale field systems, all of these appear in numbers that suggest a landscape occupied at roughly the same density as comparable parts of Britain and Ireland in the same period. The Picts were not a sparse people in an empty land. They were a dense rural population organised into farms and small communities clustered around larger centres, moving goods and information through networks that connected the smallest farm to the greatest royal fortress. And embedded in all of this ordinary, productive, densely organised daily life was a social structure built around obligations that we only partially understand. The system of hospitality and feasting that operated in the Pictish world was not simply a cultural practice. It was a political institution, a mechanism through which authority was exercised and reproduced and challenged. The Pictish king, who could host a great feast, who could gather the nobility of his territory under a single roof and provide them with abundance, was performing sovereignty as much as he was eating dinner. The ability to feast was the ability to rule. The archaeological evidence for Pictish feasting comes from several sources. The great halls that appear in the archaeological record at royal sites like Rhynie in Aberdeenshire are substantial timber buildings with interior dimensions large enough to accommodate the kind of gathering that the political and social requirements of Pictish kingship would have demanded. The animal bone assemblages from these sites show the consumption of prime-cut beef and pork in quantities that imply large-scale communal eating rather than routine domestic meals. The high-quality drinking vessels, including fragments of imported glass from the continent that appear at some Pictish sites, imply the serving of wine or mead in a context where the prestige of the drink and the vessel mattered as much as the drink itself. And Rhynie itself, the site in Aberdeenshire that has been the subject of major excavation in recent years, is producing evidence of a Pictish high-status settlement of unusual elaboration. The stone with the symbol of the Rhynie man, a figure carrying an axe with a beak-like nose that was found in the area of Rhynie, is one of the most distinctive and debated images in Pictish art, and the settlement around it is turning out to be one of the most significant Pictish sites yet investigated. There are traces of imported goods, of metalworking, of large timber structures, of a site that was functioning as a major political and economic centre for the surrounding region. Rhynie, and sites like it, give us a glimpse of Pictish political geography from the ground up rather than from the king lists down. And what they show is a landscape organised around a network of competing and cooperating centres, each with its own lord or king, and each connected to the others through the elaborate system of obligation and service and feasting that held the political structure together. Now let us talk about the people who do not appear in the king lists, whose names are not recorded in the annals, who did not commission the great symbol stones or lead the armies into battle, but without whom none of the rest of it would have been possible. Let us talk about Pictish women. The written sources about the Picts are, like most early medieval sources, primarily interested in kings and warriors and clerics, all of whom were predominantly male. Women appear in these sources mostly in relational terms, as mothers and sisters and wives of the men the sources are interested in. The Pictish women, who appear by name in the record, are almost entirely those who were related to kings, and they appear because of that relationship, rather than because of anything they did in their own right that the source writers found worth recording. And yet the picture that emerges from the archaeological evidence and from the structural features of Pictish society that we can infer from the matrilineal succession system and from comparative evidence from other societies with similar structures is of women who occupied a position of unusual political and social importance, at least within the elite. If the matrilineal succession system functioned as scholars have proposed, then the women of the Pictish royal lineage were not simply passive carriers of dynastic blood. They were active agents in the reproduction of political authority. The choice of who a Pictish princess married was a political decision of the highest importance, because that choice determined who might one day be a Pictish king. A king who could arrange a marriage between his daughter or sister and a powerful external ruler was not simply making an alliance. He was potentially extending Pictish royal legitimacy to that ruler's offspring, creating a claim that could be activated or suppressed depending on political circumstances. The management of those claims and those marriages was a form of political power exercised through women, even when it was technically exercised by their male relatives on their behalf. There is also the question of Pictish women as warriors, a question that the classical sources raise and that the Pictish evidence does not definitively settle. The Roman writers who described the peoples of northern Britain sometimes mentioned women fighting alongside men, and this has been connected to the broader tradition of warrior women in Celtic cultures, a tradition that includes figures like Boudica and Cartimandua and the various warrior women of Irish mythology. Whether Pictish women actually fought in battle as a regular or occasional practice is a question that archaeological evidence is beginning to address rather than definitively resolve. There are graves from the Iron Age and early medieval period in Scotland that contain women buried with weapons, or at least with objects that might be interpreted as weapons, and the interpretation of these graves is contested in the usual way that contested evidence always is. But the possibility that at least some Pictish women had military roles or were honoured in death with the symbols of military status cannot be dismissed as mere Roman fantasy. What is clearer is the role of women in the craft traditions that are so central to Pictish material culture. Textile production, which was almost certainly a female-dominated activity in Pictish society, as in most early medieval societies, was a significant economic and artistic enterprise. The evidence for textile production at Pictish sites includes spindle halls and loom weights, and the occasional rare survival of textile fragments. Not enough to give us a clear picture of what Pictish cloth looked like, but enough to confirm that cloth was being produced on a significant scale. In the early medieval economy, high-quality textiles were luxury goods of substantial value, and the women who produced them were skilled craftspeople whose work was economically and socially significant. The symbol stones themselves may encode information about women in ways we cannot yet read. The mirror and comb symbols that appear on many stones have traditionally been interpreted as feminine symbols associated with women or with female identity in some way. Some researchers have argued that stones bearing these symbols are memorials to women, that the pairing of the mirror and comb with other Pictish symbols identifies a specific woman in the same way that other symbol combinations identify specific men. If that is right, and it remains a hypothesis rather than a proven interpretation, then the symbol stones include a significant proportion of monuments to women, which would be extraordinary in the context of early medieval commemorative practice, where women are almost universally absent from the monumental record. The question of Pictish women and their social position connects to a broader question about Pictish society that the matrilineal succession system makes particularly interesting, namely, the question of how Pictish society organized the relationship between lineage and political power. In a patrilineal system, as in most early medieval kingdoms, the descent group through which power passes is the same as the descent group that organizes most other aspects of social life. Inheritance, landholding, obligation, vengeance, and compensation in cases of injury or death. All of these run through the male line because that is also the line through which kingship runs. In a matrilineal system, or in a system with strong matrilineal elements, these different kinds of authority can run through different descent groups, creating a social structure more complex and in some ways more flexible than the simpler patrilineal model. What this means in practice for the everyday Pict living in the 7th or 8th century is hard to say with precision, but it likely means that the relationships that mattered most for organizing daily life, access to land, obligation of military service, participation in collective ritual, were organized through maternal kinship in ways that put a different weight on different family relationships than the neighboring Irish or Anglo-Saxon systems did. The uncle through the mother may have been more important than the father in certain contexts. The mother's lineage may have had claims on individuals that the father's lineage did not. These differences in the structuring of kinship would have produced a social world that looked and felt different from the inside than the Irish or Northumbrian world, even if the basic economic activities, farming and herding, and fishing and fighting, were broadly similar. And when the matrilineal system was replaced, as it appears to have been replaced by the Gaelic patrilineal system that the Kingdom of Alba operated under, it was not just a political change. It was a social restructuring that affected the most intimate relationships and the most fundamental categories through which people organized their lives. The people who had been Picts did not simply change their name and carry on. Their social world was reorganized around different principles. Their relationships to their land, to their kin, to their obligations were restructured. Whether this reorganization felt like liberation or like loss probably depended on who you were and what position in the old system had served or not served your interests. Now there is a dimension of Pictish life that the symbol stones suggest, but that the written record almost entirely ignores, and that the difficulty of reading the symbols makes impossible to address directly. This is the question of Pictish knowledge systems, particularly what the stones might tell us about Pictish understanding of the natural world, of time, of the relationship between the human community and the broader cosmos it inhabited. Several researchers over the years have argued that some of the geometric symbols on the Pictish stones encode astronomical information. The crescent shape, which appears on many stones, has been connected to the phases of the moon. The double disc has been interpreted as a representation of the sun. The V-rod and Z-rod that bisect some of these symbols have been interpreted as markers of specific astronomical events, perhaps solstices or equinoxes, or the positions of certain stars at significant moments in the agricultural calendar. The argument, as it is usually made, is that the Picts, like many pre-modern agricultural peoples, paid close attention to the movements of celestial bodies, because those movements were practically important, that knowing when to plant and when to harvest and when to begin the seasonal movement of livestock was life or death knowledge, and that this knowledge was embedded in a cosmological framework that gave celestial events a significance beyond the purely practical. This interpretation remains controversial. The problem, as with all attempts to assign specific meaning to the Pictish symbols, is that it is not falsifiable in any rigorous way. You can see a crescent and argue it is a moon symbol, but the crescent is also just a beautiful shape that appears naturally in many artistic traditions with no astronomical connotation. You can find numerical patterns in the arrangement of symbols and argue they encode calendrical information, but numerical patterns can be found in almost any sufficiently large and complex dataset. The honest position is that we do not know whether the Pictish symbols encode astronomical information, but that a people who were as sophisticated in their observational knowledge of the natural world as the evidence suggests the Picts were, would certainly have been paying close attention to the sky, and that their artistic tradition would likely have incorporated that attention in some form. What we can say more confidently is that the placement of some Pictish monuments in the landscape appears to be deliberate in ways that involve sightlines and topographic awareness of a kind that implies careful observation and planning. Some Pictish stones are placed at locations with specific views of particular landscape features or with specific orientations relative to the rising or setting of the sun at significant times of year. Whether this reflects a systematic astronomical knowledge encoded in the placement of the stones, or simply a general aesthetic and practical preference for prominent and visually commanding locations, is another question that the evidence does not definitively resolve. The medical and botanical knowledge that the Picts presumably possessed is almost entirely invisible in the record. No Pictish medical text survives. No herbarium, no pharmacopoeia, no compendium of treatments and remedies. What we can infer from comparative evidence and from the paleo-ethno-botanical record is that Pictish people, like all pre-modern peoples in the British Isles, would have had substantial knowledge of the medicinal properties of the plants growing in their territory, knowledge accumulated and refined over generations and transmitted through exactly the kind of oral tradition that leaves no trace in the written record. The healers and herbalists and midwives of the Pictish world were carrying an enormous amount of sophisticated empirical knowledge about the natural world, and all of it died with them because it was never written down, and because the institutions that might have written it down were destroyed before they had the opportunity. This is one of the most significant losses in the Pictish catastrophe. Not the political history, which we can at least partially reconstruct from external sources, not the artistic tradition, which survives in the stones, but the practical knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how to live well in the specific landscape of northern Scotland, how to heal specific ailments with specific plants, how to predict weather from specific observations, how to manage land and water and livestock for maximum productivity in the particular ecological conditions of the Pictish heartland. That knowledge was part of what it meant to be Pictish. It was knowledge specific to the place and to the people, and it did not survive. The place names of Scotland are one of the few surviving windows into the Pictish world that the written record has not completely managed, and they repay careful attention. The Pictish language, whatever its ultimate character, left a deep imprint on the Scottish landscape that subsequent waves of Gaelic and Norse and Scots and English settlement have not completely erased. The elements that recur in Scottish place names and that appear to be of Pictish origin include pit, meaning a share of land, which appears in names like Pittenweem, Pitlochry, Pitmedden, and dozens of others concentrated in the east and northeast of Scotland, the heartland of Pictish territory. They include Aber, meaning the confluence or mouth of a river, which appears in names like Aberdeen, Aberfoyle, Aberdour, and Abernethy, and which is shared with the Brythonic tradition of the southern Britons, consistent with the view of Pictish as a variety of P-Celtic. They include the element pert or pet, meaning a bush or wood, which appears in names like Perth and Peterhead, and Cata or Cada, meaning a fortification or stronghold, which appears in various forms across the Pictish zone. These elements are not merely linguistic curiosities. They are a kind of fossilized record of how the Picts organized and named their relationship to the land. Every pit name was once a description of a specific unit of landholding with specific social meaning, a share of agricultural land held under specific conditions of tenure and obligation that were organized under the Pictish system of land law. Every Aber name was once a description of a specific geographic feature that mattered to the people who lived near it, that was used as a reference point in navigation and in the description of territory. The place names are the Pictish voice still speaking in the landscape, very quietly, very incompletely, but still present in a way that the deliberate silencing of the Pictish historical record could not quite eliminate. And this persistence of the place names is suggestive of something important about the nature of the Pictish disappearance, because the place names did not disappear when the Pictish language disappeared. They were retained by the incoming Gaelic-speaking population, modified in their pronunciation and sometimes in their form, but maintained as references to specific geographic features that the new population needed to identify just as much as the old population had. The landscape itself forced a kind of continuity. You could stop speaking Pictish. You could stop honoring Pictish kings. You could stop carving Pictish symbols. But you could not stop living on Pictish land and needing to refer to the rivers and hills and settlements that Pictish names had identified, because the rivers and hills and settlements were still there, still structuring daily life, still needing names. This suggests that the transition from Pictish to Gaelic Scotland was not a replacement of one population by another. The people did not leave, they stayed. What changed was the cultural framework through which they expressed and organized their identity. And the place names are the traces of the old framework still embedded in the new, visible to anyone who knows what to look for. The DNA evidence is consistent with this picture. Ancient DNA studies of early medieval Scottish populations are still in their early stages, with limited numbers of samples from carefully contextualized archaeological sites, but the results that have been published support a picture of population continuity rather than population replacement. The genetic signatures of people living in what is now Scotland in the early medieval period are substantially consistent with those of people living in the same areas today. There was movement, there was mixing, there was the demographic influx of Norse settlers, particularly in the north and west, that left a clear genetic signal. But there was not a wholesale replacement of the Pictish population by incoming Gaels. The Gaelicization of Scotland was primarily a cultural process, a change in the framework of identity and expression, not a biological substitution of one group of people for another. This matters because it means the descendants of the Picts are still here. They are the people of eastern and northern Scotland, carrying in their genes the biological legacy of the people who raised the symbol stones and defeated the Romans and produced the extraordinary metalwork and navigated the political complexities of early medieval Britain with a penned sophistication that the written record, which was mostly written by their enemies and their successors, has consistently underestimated. The Picts did not vanish. They became us, or they became the people of Scotland, which is a more complicated and more accurate way of putting it. What vanished was not the people, but the name and the framework of identity and the voice in the historical record. The question of why the framework of identity vanished so completely and so quickly is the question we have been circling around throughout this exploration, and it is time to address it directly. The 400 years of silence that the title of this exploration references is a somewhat misleading phrase. It is not that there are 400 years of records and then silence. It is that the Pictish period produces very thin records from the beginning, those records largely written by outsiders with particular agendas, and then, after roughly 900 CE, even those external references to the Picts as a distinct group begin to fade. What we have is not 400 years of silence, but rather 400 years of voices, speaking in a language we cannot read about a people who did not control their own historical representation, followed by a transition in which even the external references stop and the name Pict drops out of the record entirely. The silence was made. It was made by a combination of forces, some deliberate and some accidental, some driven by political calculation, and some simply by the impersonal operation of time and institutional disruption. The Viking raids that destroyed the monasteries where Pictish manuscripts might have been stored. The political reorganization that replaced Pictish ecclesiastical patronage with Gaelic ecclesiastical patronage. The Gaelicization of the prestige language that made Pictish texts irrelevant even to literate Pictish descendants. The management of historical memory by the early Scottish kingdom that had good reasons to emphasize unity and continuity rather than the complex plurality of its origins. All of these forces worked together, not necessarily in coordination, but producing the same result. And there is one more factor that deserves mention, because it speaks to something fundamental about how historical memory works and how it fails. The Pictish tradition of historical memory was primarily an oral and visual tradition. The symbol stones were one form of historical record. The oral poetry and genealogy that any aristocratic early medieval society maintained was another. These forms of memory are robust within the cultural contexts that maintain them. An oral tradition kept alive by trained specialists who memorize and transmit it generation after generation is extraordinarily resilient. It can survive for centuries without a single written word, but it is completely dependent on the existence of people who maintain it and on a community that continues to value what it preserves. Destroy the specialists or disrupt the community so thoroughly that the tradition ceases to be transmitted and the memory is gone in a single generation. The books can be rescued from a burning library. The oral tradition cannot be rescued if the people who carry it are dead or dispersed, or have shifted to a different cultural allegiance. The Pictish aristocracy, the class most likely to maintain the oral traditions of genealogy and heroic poetry and royal history, was devastated by the Viking disaster of 839 and by the subsequent political upheaval. The ecclesiastical class that might have written things down, that might have been the bridge between the oral Pictish tradition and the literate tradition that could preserve things in manuscript form, was disrupted by the same Viking raids that destroyed Portmahomac and other Pictish monasteries. And by the time stability was restored, Under the patronage of a new Gaelic kingship, the motivation to preserve specifically Pictish memories rather than broadly Scottish or Gaelic ones was absent. The people who might have done the preserving had other priorities, other identities, other traditions to maintain. This is how civilizations are forgotten, not through a single catastrophic act of erasure, though those happen too, but through the slow, compound failure of the institutions that maintain memory, through the deaths of specialists, the destruction of archives, the shifting of patronage and prestige, the gradual withdrawal of the motivation to remember that keeps a tradition alive even when circumstances are difficult. The Picts were forgotten because the series of catastrophes they experienced in the 9th century destroyed the institutional capacity for Pictish memory at exactly the moment when a new political order was being constructed that had no particular interest in maintaining it. What remains, then, is extraordinary, precisely because it survived against those odds. The symbol stones are still there. 300 of them, scattered across eastern and northern Scotland, carrying their unreadable messages about a people who wanted to be remembered and who invested enormous resources in ensuring that they would be. They are still there in churchyards and museums and open fields, still speaking their unreadable language, still demanding that we pay attention even though we cannot understand them. The place names are still there, embedding the Pictish relationship to the land in the very words we use to describe where we are. The DNA is still there, in the genes of the people of eastern Scotland, carrying the biological evidence of a population that did not disappear but simply changed its name. And there is something else that is still there, something that the stones express so powerfully that you feel it even when you cannot read the specific message. And that is the confidence. The confidence of a people who knew who they were and who believed that who they were was worth remembering. The Pictish symbol stones were not made by a people who were uncertain about their own identity or who felt that their culture was marginal or apologetic. They were made by a people who had a clear, shared, sophisticated visual language that everyone in their community could read, who felt secure enough in that language to invest enormous labor in making it permanent, and who expected that the people who came after them would understand what they had made. That confidence was not unfounded. The stones were made to last, and they have lasted. The message was intended to persist, and in a sense it has persisted, even though we can no longer decode it. The Picts wanted to be remembered, and they are remembered, though not in the way they imagined. They are remembered as a mystery, as a gap in the record, as a question mark at the beginning of Scottish history. They wanted to be remembered as themselves. And that part, that specific knowledge of who they were in their own terms and in their own voice, that is what was lost. The loss was not inevitable. It was made by specific historical forces operating in a specific historical context. Viking raids and political instability and the management of memory by a new kingdom and the impersonal operation of time and institutional decay. All of these things conspired to produce the silence that faces us when we try to look directly at the Picts. But conspiracies, even uncoordinated ones, can leave traces. And the traces that the Picts left, in the stones and the place names and the DNA and the fragmentary written records, are enough to tell us that what was lost was substantial and real and human and worth mourning. The Drust and Talorcan dynasty, the last Pictish kings who bore specifically Pictish names and who seem to have been trying to maintain something of the old tradition in the face of everything that was happening around them, are worth dwelling on for a moment. The name Drust, or Drosten in its later form, was one of the most common names in the Pictish king lists, appearing across centuries as a marker of royal identity within the Pictish tradition. The name Talorcan similarly appears repeatedly, both as a given name and as a name element in compound royal names. These were names that carried the weight of Pictish royal identity. When the last rulers to bear these names disappear from the record in the mid to late 9th century, something specific disappears with them. Not just individuals, but a naming tradition that was itself a form of historical consciousness, a deliberate connection to the Pictish royal past, maintained through the decision to give children names that had been borne by Pictish kings for generations. The people who bore those names understood what they were doing when they chose them for their children. They were saying, this child belongs to a tradition. This child is connected to a lineage. This child is Pictish, in a specific and meaningful way. When those names stopped being given, when the Talorcan and Drust and Nectan names of the Pictish royal tradition are replaced by the Constantine and Corzantine and Mael Coluim and Donchad names of the Gaelic kingship tradition, the transition is not just linguistic. It is a statement about which past is considered relevant and worth perpetuating. The new names claim a new ancestry. They orient the kingdom's sense of itself toward a different set of ancestors and a different set of traditions. They perform the shift in identity that the political changes have made and that the ecclesiastical reorganization has endorsed. This is how kingdoms construct their own histories. Not by denying the past, but by selecting which parts of the past they want to be descended from. The kingdom of Alba was not a kingdom that denied having Pictish predecessors. Early texts acknowledge that the kings of Alba ruled territory that had been Pictish, but the kingdom constructed its identity in ways that made the Pictish past a remote and somewhat mysterious prehistory rather than a living tradition with a direct line to the present. The Picts became the people who were before us, rather than the people we were before we changed our name. That distinction matters. A people who were before us are interesting and mysterious, and perhaps romantically connected to the land, but they are separate, they are other. Their traditions are curiosities, their monuments are puzzles, their language is an enigma, whereas a people who were us before we changed our name are ancestral in a different and more demanding sense. They are owed something. Their traditions are our traditions, their language is our lost language, their monuments are our monuments, and we have an obligation to understand them rather than simply to marvel at them. The Picts deserve the second kind of recognition. They are not a mystery people from an exotic past. They are the ancestors of the people of Scotland, speaking a language that was ancestral to the modern landscape, building traditions that fed into the culture that came after them, carrying in their genes and their place names and their carved stones a specific form of human intelligence and human creativity and human social organization that is part of what it means to be from this part of the world. To forget them completely, or to treat them as a romantic puzzle rather than as real people who lived real lives and made real choices and were subject to real historical forces, is to participate, however unintentionally, in the erasure that began in the 9th century. The modern rediscovery of the Picts, which is what we are living through now, is a kind of undoing of that erasure. The archaeological projects that are finding new settlement sites and new metalwork and new evidence of Pictish economic and social life. The DNA studies that are connecting the Pictish past to the present population of Scotland, the linguistic work that is pushing further into the question of what Pictish actually was and how it relates to the other languages of early medieval Britain, the art historical work that is developing new frameworks for understanding the symbol stones without forcing them into interpretive categories derived from better documented traditions. All of this work is part of an ongoing project of recovery, of trying to give the Picts back the specificity and the reality that the historical record denied them. It is slow work. It is incomplete work. The fundamental obstacle, the near-total absence of Pictish texts in Pictish language, saying Pictish things about Pictish experience, cannot be overcome by archaeology or DNA or careful attention to the place names. The voice is gone, and there is no technology that can recover it. What we can do is listen more carefully to everything that remains, paying attention to the stones not just as art objects but as documents, to the place names not just as linguistic curiosities but as geography with human meaning, to the DNA not just as population statistics but as evidence of lives lived and families maintained and communities sustained across the centuries of the Pictish period. And perhaps most importantly, we can sit with the mystery honestly. We can resist the temptation to fill the silence with confident explanations that the evidence does not support. The Picts were not alien. They were not a lost tribe of Israel or a remnant of Atlantis, or a people with supernatural powers who vanished because they transcended history. They were people who had the bad luck to lose their institutional infrastructure at a moment of multiple simultaneous crises, and who were subject to the same processes of cultural displacement and historical management that have operated throughout human history whenever one political order replaces another. What happened to the Picts is not a mystery in the sense that it requires exotic explanation. It is a tragedy in the sense that a real and rich human civilization was lost, and that the loss was not inevitable, and that the world would have been a more knowable place if it had not happened, And there is one more thing worth saying before we move toward the end of this exploration. The Pictish disappearance from the historical record in the centuries after 900 CE is not simply a Scottish story. It is a story about how history is made, about who controls the record, about whose voices get preserved and whose get lost. The Picts are an unusually clear example of the general principle that the historical record is never neutral, that it always reflects the priorities and the power of those who produced it, that the absence of a voice in the record does not mean the absence of the people who would have spoken it. Every human community that has ever existed has had things worth saying about who they were and how they lived and what they believed and how they organized their world. The overwhelming majority of those communities left nothing in the written record, or left only traces mediated through the accounts from a people who were looking at them from outside and with particular purposes. The Picts are unusual only in the degree to which their physical evidence is so visible and so eloquent and so clearly the product of a sophisticated civilization, while the verbal record that would allow us to understand that evidence on its own terms is absent. Most forgotten civilizations are both physically and verbally absent. The Picts left us the stones, and the stones make the absence of the voice more poignant, not less, because they demonstrate so clearly that there was something there worth preserving. The symbol on the stone near the field in Angus is still speaking. It has been speaking for 1200 years. We just cannot hear it yet. To understand the full depth of what was lost when the Pictish world ended, we need to spend some time inside the question of what the Pictish relationship with Christianity actually looked like. Not as a simple conversion story from paganism to the faith, but as the complex negotiation between a living indigenous tradition and a literate international religion that it is when you look at the evidence carefully. Because the story of Pictish Christianity is not the same as the story of Irish Christianity or Northumbrian Christianity, even though it borrowed from both. It was something specific, something that emerged from the meeting of the Columban mission with an existing Pictish religious and intellectual tradition, and something that produced, in the brief century or two before the Viking disruption, one of the most distinctive artistic and intellectual cultures in early medieval Europe. The conversion of the Picts was not a single event with a single date. It was a process that began before Columba and continued long after him. There is evidence, contested but significant, of Christian activity in southern Pictish territory from the late 5th century, connected to the figure of Ninian, a bishop whose sphere of activity seems to have been centred on Whithorn in Galloway, but who later tradition credits with missionary work among the southern Picts. The historicity of the details surrounding Ninian is difficult to establish, and the connection to southern Pictish Christianity has been built largely on later hagiographic sources that reflect the concerns of 8th century Northumbrian Christianity as much as they reflect 5th century realities. But the archaeological evidence from sites like Whithorn and from some locations in southern Pictish territory does suggest early Christian activity in this region that predates the Columban mission of the 560s. The Columban mission itself was a different kind of operation. Columba came from a major Irish aristocratic family, the Uí Níl, who were the dominant political force in Northern Ireland in the 6th century. He was a man of enormous personal energy and political connection, and the monastery he founded on Iona in 563 CE became within decades one of the most important ecclesiastical institutions in the northern British Isles. Iona was not simply a house of prayer. It was a scriptorium, a school, a centre of pilgrimage and ecclesiastical diplomacy, and eventually the mother house of a network of daughter monasteries that extended from Ireland through Dalriada into Pictish territory and beyond. The influence Iona exercised over the religious life of Pictish territory in the late 6th and 7th centuries was substantial and growing. But Iona's influence was not simply absorbed by the Picts. It was engaged with, negotiated with, and in some cases resisted. The Pictish Church, as it developed in the 7th and 8th centuries, was not simply a colonial outpost of the Columban mission. It had its own character, its own sites of authority, its own theological emphases, and its own relationship to the secular Pictish political structure. The major Pictish ecclesiastical sites, places like Rosemarkie on the Black Isle, Abernethy in Perthshire, and above all Port Mahomac on the Tarbat Peninsula, were not simply Columban foundations. They drew on the Columban tradition but also on other sources of ecclesiastical culture, including the broader continental Christian tradition that was increasingly asserting itself in Britain through the 7th century. The Tarbat Peninsula excavations, which have been conducted over many years by a team led by Martin Carver, have transformed our understanding of Pictish Christianity. What was found at Port Mahomac was not a simple rural monastery, but a major production and learning centre that was operating at a very high level of sophistication. The evidence for vellum preparation is extensive. Large numbers of animal bones showing the specific pattern of skinning required to produce vellum of manuscript quality were found across the site, which implies that the monastery was producing substantial quantities of parchment. Given the scale of vellum production, the monastery must also have been producing manuscripts on that parchment, though none of the manuscripts themselves survive. The stone carving at Port Mahomac was also exceptional. The site produced numerous fragments of carved stone, some with Pictish symbols, some with interlaced decoration of high quality, some with figural scenes of both religious and possibly secular character. The craftsmen working at Port Mahomac were operating at the same level as the great scriptoria and carving schools of Ireland and Northumbria, and they were producing work that was recognisably part of the broader insular artistic tradition, while also being distinctly Pictish in ways that reflect a local tradition of visual culture rather than simple imitation of external models. All of this was destroyed. The destruction layer at Port Mahomac is clearly the result of violent attack rather than accidental fire or gradual decay. The burning was intense and widespread. Objects were not carefully removed before the destruction. Carved stones were knocked over, and some were defaced. The physical evidence of violence is unambiguous. The timing, based on radiocarbon dating and archaeological stratigraphy, puts the destruction in the early 9th century, consistent with the intensification of Viking raiding that the historical sources also record for this period. What was in the Port Mahomac scriptorium when it burned, we cannot know. But given the scale of vellum production and the evidence for high-quality stone carving, the probability is that there were manuscripts there that contained Pictish intellectual production in some form, whether religious texts, historical records, poetry, law, or some combination of all of these. The particular tragedy of Port Mahomac is not just that the monastery was destroyed, but that the destruction came at precisely the moment when Pictish ecclesiastical culture was at its peak of sophistication and production. If the monastery had survived another century, if the manuscripts produced there had been carried to safety and copied and preserved in the way that the manuscripts of Irish monasteries were carried and copied during periods of Viking disruption, we might have a completely different picture of the Picts today. The Irish response to Viking raiding is instructive by contrast. When the monasteries of Ireland were attacked, and they were attacked repeatedly and severely, the institutional response was to move manuscripts to safer locations, to copy important texts and distribute them to daughter houses, to find ways of maintaining the tradition even when specific buildings and libraries were destroyed. The Irish Church of the 9th and 10th centuries was severely disrupted by Viking activity, but the literary and intellectual tradition it carried was robust enough to survive that disruption, largely because the network of monasteries was wide enough and the commitment to textual preservation was strong enough that no single attack could eliminate the whole corpus. Kells, Durrow, Clonmacnoise, Armagh each carried copies of texts that the others also held. The destruction of one did not destroy the tradition. The Pictish Church does not seem to have had the same kind of redundant preservation network. This may be because the Pictish ecclesiastical network was smaller and more centralized around a few key sites, so that the destruction of those sites was more decisive. It may be because the Pictish Church had a different relationship to textual culture than the Irish Church, one in which the visual and oral traditions were more central than the written. It may simply be because the timing of the Viking disruption in the north and east of Scotland was particularly severe and came before the Pictish Church had fully developed the kind of preservation infrastructure that would have been necessary to survive it. Whatever the specific reasons, the result is the same. The texts that would have given us the Pictish voice are gone, and the tradition that would have transmitted them is gone, and what remains is the archaeology, and the stones, and the place names, and the fragments that survived outside the specific institutional network that the Vikings destroyed. There is a particular irony in the Norse dimension of the Pictish story that deserves comment, because the Norse, who did so much to destabilize and ultimately destroy the Pictish political world, were themselves later absorbed into the Scottish kingdom that the Pictish collapse had made possible. The Norse settlement of the Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, replaced a Pictish population that had been there for centuries with a Norse population that displaced or absorbed the existing community. But within a few generations, those Norse settlers were also part of a Scottish world, also subject to the cultural and political forces that were making Alba the organising framework for everyone north of the Forth and Clyde. The Vikings who broke the Pictish world were themselves eventually incorporated into a world that the Pictish collapse had shaped. The wheel of historical irony turns in northern Scotland as it turns everywhere else. And then the Norse left their own traces in the place names and the DNA and the cultural practices of the northern and western Scottish world, just as the Picts had left theirs. The landscape of Scotland is a palimpsest, a text written over and over again by different hands using different languages, and the Pictish layer is the one that has been hardest to read, not because it is the thinnest, but because the specific interpretive traditions that would have made it legible were themselves erased. Let us think for a moment about what reading that layer would tell us if we could, not what we could hypothetically reconstruct about Pictish political history or Pictish art history, important as both of those are, but what it would tell us about the deeper questions, about the Pictish understanding of what it meant to be human, what it meant to live well, what obligations individuals owed to their communities and their ancestors, and the land they inhabited. Every civilization encodes its answers to these questions in its practices and its art and its language. The way a society organizes its kinship system, as the Picts organized theirs through the female line, reflects a particular understanding of which relationships are most fundamental and which obligations are most binding. The way a society commemorates its dead, as the Picts commemorated theirs with permanent stone monuments covered in a shared symbolic language, reflects a particular understanding of what memory means and who it is for. The way a society organizes its political authority, as the Picts organized theirs through a combination of hereditary claim and something more complicated that we still do not fully understand, reflects a particular answer to the question of where legitimate power comes from and what it is supposed to do. The Pictish answers to these questions were not the same as the answers of their Irish or Northumbrian or Norse neighbours. They were distinctive, specific, the product of a particular history, lived in a particular landscape by a particular community over many generations, and they are almost entirely lost to us. What remains are the traces, the stones, and the names, and the fragments, enough to know that the answers existed and were sophisticated and were worth preserving, but not enough to know what the answers actually were. This is the condition we are in with the Picts, and it is a condition that should produce humility rather than confident theorizing. The temptation, when faced with a mysterious people who left no texts, is to project onto them whatever one wishes. The romantic nationalists of the 19th century projected onto the Picts, a heroic Caledonian ancestor people who embodied the spirit of Scottish independence. The alternative historians of the 20th and 21st centuries have projected onto them all manner of exotic identities, from lost Atlanteans to alien half-breeds to carriers of secret bloodlines. Both of these projective enterprises are responses to the same void, the absence of a Pictish voice to correct the projections. The discipline that the evidence demands is harder. It is the discipline of staying close to what can actually be known, even when what can be known is much less satisfying than the romantic or the exotic alternatives. The Picts were people. They lived in eastern and northern Scotland for roughly 5 centuries as a recognizable political and cultural entity. They built things and carved things and traded and farmed and fought and governed themselves according to principles we only partially understand. They were destroyed not by any inherent weakness or mystical insufficiency, but by the compound effect of Viking disruption, political reorganization, and the management of historical memory by the kingdom that succeeded them. And their descendants are still living in the land they inhabited, carrying their genes and walking past their stones and using their place names, mostly without knowing that any of this is what they are doing. The modern archaeological work that is bringing new Pictish sites to light and providing new perspectives on Pictish daily life is one of the most exciting frontiers in current British archaeology. The excavations at Rhynie, which have continued to reveal new aspects of the settlement and its role as a major Pictish centre, are providing a ground-level view of Pictish aristocratic life that the king lists and annals cannot supply. The analysis of the Rini Man stone and the complex of high-status material culture from that site is adding new dimensions to the understanding of how Pictish political authority expressed itself in physical form. The application of LiDAR technology to the Scottish landscape is revealing settlement patterns at a scale and resolution that was not previously possible. LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to create detailed three-dimensional maps of the ground surface beneath vegetation, can detect the subtle earthwork signatures of long-vanished structures that are completely invisible to the naked eye, and that only appear as crop marks in aerial photographs under very specific conditions. In the Pictish heartland, LiDAR surveys are finding enclosed settlements, field systems, and other traces of land use that massively increase the number of known sites, and that give a much denser and more complex picture of Pictish landscape organization than anything the pre-LiDAR evidence suggested. The Picts are becoming more present in their landscape with each new survey, their settlements multiplying as the technology reveals what was always there but never seen. The ancient DNA work on Scottish populations is still in its early stages, but is already producing results that connect the historical and archaeological evidence to the biological reality of population history. The key finding, consistent across the studies published so far, is that the genetic profile of the population of eastern and northern Scotland shows the continuity of a population that has been in this area since at least the Iron Age, and that was not displaced or replaced by either the Gaelic political reorganization of the 9th century or the later medieval period. The Pictish genetic signal did not disappear with the Pictish political identity. It persisted, as it had to persist, because the people stayed even when their name and their language and their institutional structures changed. This genetic continuity has an interesting implication for how we think about Scottish national identity. If the population of Scotland has been substantially in place since the Iron Age, and if the Pictish period represents a major part of the historical experience of that population, then Pictish history is Scottish history in a more direct sense than the narrative of Gaelic origins that the Kingdom of Alba promoted would suggest. The Kingdom of Alba told a story in which the Gaels were the founding people of Scotland and the Picts were an absorbed predecessor group. The genetic evidence tells a different story, one in which the people who were Picts became Scots not through replacement, but through renaming, and in which the continuity of the population connects the Pictish past to the Scottish present in a biologically unbroken line. This is a politically charged finding in the context of Scottish national identity, which has been a contested and intensely debated topic in recent decades. But the political implications should not distract from the historical ones. The Picts are not exotic others in the Scottish past. They are part of the deep root system from which Scottish civilization grew, and understanding them, to whatever extent we can, is part of understanding where Scotland comes from and what it has been through. There are researchers working today who are pushing the boundaries of what can be known about the Picts in ways that would not have been possible even 20 years ago. The continuing analysis of the symbol stones, using new imaging technologies that can reveal details of carving and surface treatment invisible to the naked eye, is providing new data about how the stones were made and how they were used. Some stones show evidence of pigment, of having been painted in colours that have long since weathered away, which means the visual experience of encountering a Pictish stone in the 8th century was quite different from the experience of encountering it now. A symbol that appears as a simple incised line on bare stone may once have blazed with colour, may once have been as visually striking as the illuminated pages of the great Irish manuscripts. The linguistic analysis of Pictish names and inscriptions is also moving forward, with new computational approaches being applied to the sparse corpus of Pictish linguistic evidence. Whether these approaches will eventually crack the code of the longer Ogham inscriptions, whether they will be able to determine definitively whether Pictish was a Celtic language or something more archaic, remains to be seen. But the methodological resources available now are substantially greater than what was available to previous generations of scholars, and the possibility of genuine progress is real, even if the ultimate answers remain uncertain. What is not uncertain is the importance of the question. Understanding what happened to the Picts is not simply an academic exercise in reconstructing a dead civilization. It is a window into the fundamental processes by which historical memory is made and unmade, by which civilizations are lost and found, by which the past is managed to serve the needs of the present. The Picts are a particularly clear example of these processes, because the contrast between the sophistication of their physical evidence and the poverty of the written record about them is so stark. They force the question of why some voices survive and others do not, and the answer to that question is always about power. The people who controlled the written record in early medieval Scotland were not neutral archivists, preserving everything they could for the benefit of future generations. They were participants in a political and ecclesiastical project that had specific goals and specific interests, and those goals and interests shaped what they recorded and what they did not record, what they emphasized and what they minimized, whose names they preserved and whose they let fall into silence. This is not unusual. This is how all historical records work. But it is useful to be reminded of it, because it applies not just to the Picts, but to every marginalized and silenced community in every historical record ever produced. The absence of a voice in the archive is not evidence of the absence of something worth saying. It is evidence of power, of who had the institutional means to speak and who did not. The Picts had those means for a while. They had the monasteries and the scriptoria, and presumably the intellectual life that goes with them. They had the tradition of carving stones, and what that tradition implies about an organized and sustained investment in public communication. They had the oral traditions of a sophisticated aristocratic society that valued the preservation and transmission of memory. And then, in the space of a few decades, most of those institutional means were taken away from them by Vikings and by political reorganization and by the quiet operation of prestige and patronage, and what remained was not enough to sustain the Pictish voice against the voices of those who came after. That story matters. It mattered to the Picts, who lost their voice. It matters to us, because we are impoverished by that loss in ways we cannot fully measure. We cannot know what we have lost when we have lost the ability to know it, but we can know that something was there, that it was substantial, that it was human, and that its absence is a real absence, rather than simply the natural fading of something that was never very significant. The 400 years of Pictish history that we can partially trace, from roughly 500 CE to roughly 900 CE, were 400 years of real life lived by real people in a real landscape. Kings who made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Artists who worked for years on a single stone, refining their technique, developing their vocabulary of symbols, trying to make something that would last. Farmers who cleared ground and built fences and watched the seasons turn. Women who managed households and bore children and negotiated the complex social world of early medieval Scotland with the intelligence and adaptability that survival in that world required. Monks who copied manuscripts and prayed and argued about theology and organized the ecclesiastical life of a kingdom that was simultaneously Christian and distinctly itself. All of these lives, in all of their particularity and complexity, are behind the stones and the place names and the fragments that remain. And perhaps that is the most honest thing we can say at the end of this exploration. Not that we have solved the mystery of the Picts. We have not. Not that we have filled the silence with sound. We cannot. But that we have understood a little better why the silence is there, and what was silenced, and what it costs, in human terms, to lose a civilization's voice. The Pictish silence is not a natural silence, the silence of a people who had nothing to say. It is a made silence, a silence produced by specific historical forces operating on a specific human community. And understanding how it was made is the first step toward understanding why it matters that it happened. The stones are still there, 300 of them, or more that we have not yet found, standing in Scottish fields and churchyards, embedded in museum walls, lying in storage, waiting for the next researcher to look at them with fresh eyes and new tools. They have been waiting for 1,200 years. They can wait a little longer, but they are waiting, and they are speaking, in a language that we have not yet fully learned to hear. Somewhere in the landscape of eastern Scotland, in Angus, or in Aberdeenshire, or in Easter Ross, or on the island of Shetland, there may be stones we have not yet found. There may be settlements beneath the fields that the LiDAR surveys have not yet covered. There may be fragments of manuscript in monastery archives that have not yet been connected to the Pictish world they came from. There may be DNA patterns in living populations that have not yet been analyzed in the right way to reveal what they carry from the Pictish past. The recovery is not complete. The recovery may never be complete, but it is ongoing, and every piece that is recovered adds something to the picture of a people who deserve to be remembered and who made everything they could to ensure that they would be. The Pictish symbol carved on the stone in the field is still speaking. We are just learning, slowly, imperfectly, with the inadequate tools we have, to listen to what it is trying to tell us. And while we are learning to listen to the stones, there is something worth sitting with quietly. Something about what the Pictish story tells us, not just about the Picts, but about ourselves, about the fragility of civilization and the durability of humanity, about the way that the worst things, the Viking raids, and the political catastrophes, and the institutional collapses, never quite manage to eliminate the people. The people stay, they adapt, they carry forward whatever they can carry. They give their children new names that fit the new world, while still living in the landscape that the old names described. They become something new without entirely ceasing to be what they were. And the traces of what they were remain in the land, in the genes, in the words used to describe the rivers and the headlands and the places where people have always lived. This is what the Pictish story ultimately is. Not a story of disappearance, but a story of transformation. Of a people who did not vanish but became part of something larger, while the specific shape of what they had been was gradually obscured by time and politics and the management of memory. The Picts are not gone. They are in the people of Scotland, carrying the genetic memory of 5 centuries of existence in the north. They are in the landscape, encoded in the place names that still use the words they used to describe the land. They are in the stones, speaking their unreadable language across 12 centuries of silence to anyone willing to stand still long enough and pay attention. The mystery of the Picts is real. It is a genuine historical mystery, produced by genuine historical forces, and it will not be entirely resolved in our lifetimes or perhaps in any lifetime to come. But it is not an impenetrable mystery. It is a mystery with a human shape, the shape of a civilization that wanted to be remembered and that used every means at its disposal to ensure that it would be. And that was defeated not by any failure of its own making, but by the compound of external catastrophes and internal political transformation that broke the chain of transmission in the 9th century. That defeat is worth mourning, as all genuine losses are worth mourning, and mourning it, understanding what was lost and why, is itself a form of remembering. It is a way of refusing to accept the silence as complete, of insisting that behind the silence there was something real and significant that deserves better than the exotic projections and the romantic fantasies that the void has too often invited. The Picts deserve the respect of honest uncertainty rather than the false certainty of theories that fill their silence with what we want to hear. They were people. They lived. They built extraordinary things. They loved their children and buried their dead with care, and argued about theology and debated which king should succeed, which other king, and worried about the harvest, and watched the Moray Firth in autumn when the light turns a tace, particular shade of silver that you only get in the north. They spoke a language that sounded like nothing else spoken in the early medieval world. They looked at the stone they were about to carve, and they saw in it the possibility of permanence, of saying something that would outlast them, of speaking across time to whoever came after. And here we are, whoever came after, standing in front of the stone, unable to read the message but certain that the message is there. That certainty is itself a form of fidelity to the Picts. It is a refusal to pretend that the silence is the whole story. It is an insistence that behind the carved symbols, behind the unreadable inscriptions, behind the fragmentary annals and the contradictory king lists and the burned monasteries and the lost manuscripts, there was something worth knowing. There still is something worth knowing. And as long as people keep looking at the stones and asking what they are trying to say, the Pictish voice has not been entirely silenced. Perhaps that is enough. For now, in this particular moment, perhaps that is enough. There is a quietness that settles over the Pictish landscape at dusk. If you have ever stood near one of the great symbol stones in late afternoon, when the light comes in low and horizontal and turns the carved surfaces to gold, you will know the particular quality of attention that the stones invite. They do not demand anything of you. They do not shout. They simply stand there, in their 12 centuries of patience, carrying their symbols into the failing light, with the same equanimity they have carried them through every night and every storm and every change of regime that has happened since they were raised. They are not waiting for you to solve them. They are not disappointed by your inability to read them. They are simply present, as they have always been present, as the people who made them intended them to be present, permanent and silent and speaking. In that silence, if you stay long enough, you can feel something. Not a supernatural feeling, not the thrill of conspiracy theories or alien theories or lost civilization theories, something quieter and more real than any of those. The feeling of being connected to a human community that existed before you and that put something in the world that was intended for you, even though they could not have known you would come. The feeling that the effort of making these things was not wasted, even though so much that went with them was lost. The feeling that permanence is possible, in stone and in symbol, and in the persistence of people in their landscape, even when everything else changes. The Picts knew that feeling too. They made these things because they knew it. They stood in front of blank stone and saw in it the possibility of saying something that would last, and they were right. The stones have lasted. The message has not been understood, but the fact of the message has persisted. Undeniable, 1,200 years after the hands that carved it went back to the earth. That is what you are sleeping near tonight. Not a mystery in the sensational sense, not a secret waiting to be revealed, or a conspiracy waiting to be uncovered, but a genuine human absence, a real voice that was silenced by real historical forces, still present in the physical objects it left behind, still legible enough to know that something was there, still asking, across all the centuries of silence, for the respect and the attention that any human civilization deserves from the people who come after it. Rest now, if you are listening in the dark. The stones will still be standing when you wake. The symbols will still be unread, but they will not be unnoticed. And perhaps that is the most honest kind of remembering we can offer to the Picts in the long silence that has followed their own. The fields of eastern Scotland hold their memory in the soil. The rivers carry their names to the sea. The people who live there carry their genes without knowing it, going about their days in a landscape that the Picts shaped and named and loved. In whatever way, early medieval people loved the land they depended on and the community that made their lives possible. The inheritance is real, even when it is invisible. The connection is unbroken, even when it is unrecognized. Somewhere in the night, if it is quiet enough, and if you are paying the right kind of attention, you might almost hear something. Not words, because the words are gone. Not symbols, because the symbols are unreadable. But something underneath the words and the symbols, something in the register of presence and intention and the human desire to be known and remembered. Something that says, we were here. We made these things. We lived in this land, and we loved it, and we tried to leave something of ourselves in it for whoever came after. You came after, and for whatever it is worth, across 1,200 years of silence, you are listening. Let that thought carry you gently toward sleep tonight. The Picts wanted to be remembered. You have spent these hours remembering them, however imperfectly, however incomplete the picture remains. That act of remembering is not nothing. It is, perhaps, the closest thing to fidelity that we can offer to the dead, to sit with their mystery honestly, without pretending to know what we do not know, without filling their silence with what we wish were there instead of what is there, but also without accepting the silence as the whole truth of who they were. To insist, quietly and with the humility that the evidence requires, that the silence is not the whole story, that behind it, as behind every silence in history, there were people. Complex, creative, politically sophisticated, artistically extraordinary people who lived full lives in a real landscape and who tried, with everything they had, to leave something of themselves for us to find. They did not fail at that. The stones are there, the names are there, the genes are there, and now, tonight, so is the attention that they were always hoping for. So is the listening that the symbol on the stone, still speaking in its unreadable language, was always intended to invite. The night is quiet, the mystery remains, and the Picts, in whatever sense they can still be said to exist, are perhaps a little less forgotten than they were when this began. If you have found your way here through curiosity or through the particular comfort that long stories about history provide in the hours when sleep feels just out of reach, then you have also found something of what these explorations are made for. History is not a collection of settled facts to be memorized and put away. It is a living conversation with the dead, who are always more complex and more human and more present than the silences they left behind would suggest. The Picts are one of the most eloquent examples of that, because their silence is so loud, so clearly made rather than natural, so charged with the evidence of a sophistication that the silence itself cannot hide. You can close your eyes now. The questions will still be there in the morning, but they will wait. They have been waiting for 1200 years. They are patient. The stones are patient. The symbols are patient. And the slow, ongoing work of listening to what they are trying to say will continue tomorrow and the day after, in the excavations and the laboratories and the archives and the quiet offices where researchers spend their lives trying to hear a voice that was silenced before any of us were born. For now, though, there is only this, the darkness and the quiet, and somewhere in the north of Scotland a field where a stone stands in the last of the evening light, its symbols catching the shadows, its message intact even though no one who passes can read it. It has been standing there for a very long time. It will still be standing there in the morning. It is patient in a way that only stone can be patient, and in that patience it carries something of the people who made it, something of their desire to be known, something of their insistence that what they were, and what they made, and what they knew about the world they lived in was worth preserving. They were right about that. Everything that has been traced and analysed and argued over and wondered about in these hours of exploration confirms that they were right. What they were was worth preserving, and what was lost when it was not preserved is worth mourning, quietly, honestly, without melodrama, but with the genuine sorrow that any real loss deserves. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now, and what time it is where you are, and whether you are lying in the dark, listening to the history of a people who spent 5 centuries building stones to speak across time to whoever would come after them. The thought of all those different places, all those different hours, all those different people lying in the dark paying attention to the same mystery at the same moment, connected by curiosity, and by the particular comfort that long stories about the past provide in the quiet of the night. That thought is one of the reasons these explorations feel worth making. You are part of a long chain of people paying attention to things that deserve it. The Picts were paying attention to their landscape and their history and the obligation to remember. You are paying attention to them. The chain does not break just because the language changes and the centuries accumulate and the specific voice gets lost. The attention continues, the listening continues, and the stones, in their 1200 years of patience, are perhaps as close to grateful as stone can be. Rest well. The mystery will be there in the morning. So will the stones. So will the unread symbols, still speaking, still waiting, still carrying their message across the centuries, in a language that we have not yet learned to hear, but that we have not stopped trying to understand. That persistence, yours and theirs, is perhaps the truest form of fidelity that time allows. The fields of Scotland hold their silence. The light fades from the symbols on the stone. Somewhere in the north, in the quiet that follows the end of a long day and a long exploration, the Picts rest in their landscape, in the soil, and the names and the genes, and the carved surfaces of 300 monuments still standing across the land they made and loved, and could not, in the end, hold on to, though they tried. They tried with everything they had. And you, listening now in your own darkness, are part of the reason that the trying was not entirely in vain. Sleep, and let the mystery do what mysteries do in the dark, not resolve itself, because it will not, but settle into something more comfortable than wakefulness, something that belongs to the space between knowing and not knowing, where most of the interesting things in history actually live. Good night. The stones are still standing, the story is not over, it just needs the morning to go on. Let us go deeper into the specific individuals who shaped the Pictish world at its height, because history told only through abstract forces and structural processes loses the texture of the actual experience. The Picts were not simply a collection of cultural practices and archaeological sites. They were a kingdom of specific people, making specific decisions under specific pressures, and some of those people are recoverable enough from the fragmentary record to stand as real individuals rather than simply as names in a list. Bride Mac Malchon, the king who received Columba in 565 CE, is the first Pictish king who comes into focus with anything like individuality. He appears in the record because Columba's biographer Adomnan chose to describe the visit at some length, and because the meeting between the Irish abbot and the northern Pictish king was significant enough to have been remembered in the Columban tradition. What Adomnan's description gives us is a king who is not immediately receptive to Columba's mission, who has a druid named Brochan in his household, whom Adomnan describes as violently hostile to the Christian missionaries, and who is clearly a man of substantial political authority, who rules a kingdom large enough and secure enough to afford the luxury of skepticism about Irish ecclesiastical claims. The nature of the religious conflict at Bridie's court, as Adomnan tells it, is presented as a series of miraculous confrontations between Columba's spiritual power and Brochan's druidic power. A locked gate opens of its own accord. A favourable wind appears at Columba's prayer. An angry creature in the River Ness, possibly the first recorded sighting of what later became the Loch Ness Monster legend, is driven back by a gesture from the saint. All of this is hagiographic convention, the standard demonstration of a saint's holiness through power over the natural world and over hostile supernatural forces. But underneath the conventional structure, there is a real political situation. Columba needs something from Bridie: the freedom to operate in Pictish territory, the protection of his mission, perhaps a more formal ecclesiastical relationship, and Bridie needs something from Columba: the relationship with a powerful Irish ecclesiastical figure with connections to the dominant political dynasty of Northern Ireland would have had real diplomatic value in the complex multi-kingdom politics of 6th century Britain and Ireland. What Bridie decided, in the end, was to allow the Columban mission access to Pictish territory without, as far as we can tell, personally converting in any way that disrupted his existing power structures. Brochan, the hostile druid, continues to appear in the narrative as part of the royal household even after the visit. Bridie's court was not converted wholesale or immediately. What happened was a negotiated opening, a pragmatic decision by a sophisticated political actor to add a new option to his range of external connections without foreclosing any of the existing ones. This is not the conversion story that Columba's biographers wanted to tell. They wanted a story of royal capitulation to divine power, of a king humbled and changed by his encounter with the true God. What the evidence suggests is something more interesting and more politically realistic, a negotiation between two different kinds of institutional power, in which the religious dimension was one aspect of a broader diplomatic encounter rather than the whole story. Bridie Mac Maelchon died around 584 CE, having ruled for approximately 30 years, a remarkably long reign by the standards of early medieval kingship, where violent succession disputes and military defeat regularly cut royal careers short. His kingdom at his death was probably the most powerful political entity in northern Britain, extending across most of what is now mainland Scotland, north of the Forth, and engaging as an equal with the major powers of Ireland and Northumbria and Dalriada. The king who looms largest in the historical record of the 7th century is another Bridie Mac Baile, who ruled from around 671 to 693 CE, and whose reign is distinguished above all by the Battle of Nectansmere in 685 CE. This is the engagement we discussed in connection with the Abelemno stone, the battle at which Bridie Mac Baile killed the Northumbrian king Egfrith and put an end to Northumbrian expansionism in the north. The victory at Nectansmere was not simply a military triumph, though it was certainly that. It was a political statement of the most emphatic kind. For several decades before 685, Northumbria had been the most powerful kingdom in northern Britain, and Northumbrian ambition had extended north of the Firth of Forth in ways that threatened Pictish autonomy and perhaps Pictish survival as an independent political entity. Egfrith's campaign of 685 was not the first Northumbrian incursion into Pictish territory, but it was the one that encountered a Pictish response, prepared and organised enough to turn a Northumbrian advance into a catastrophic defeat. Bridie Mac Baile had managed to lure Egfrith's army into terrain of Pictish choosing, a landscape of lochs and boggy ground near a lake that the sources called Lyn Garan, and there he allowed the Northumbrian army to commit itself before the ambush that destroyed it. Egfrith died on the field, along with a significant portion of his military following. It was, by the standards of 7th century warfare, an annihilating victory, and its consequences were immediate and lasting. Northumbrian expansion north of the Forth ended. The ecclesiastical territory that the Northumbrian Church had been developing in southern Pictish lands, including the See of Abercorn, collapsed. The political weight of the 7th century in northern Britain shifted decisively back toward the Pictish north. Bede's description of the battle is brief and laden with theological interpretation that reflects his view of Ecgfrith's hubris in attacking a people who had not provoked him. But even through that theological framework, you can sense the magnitude of the shock. For Northumbrians, Nectansmere was a trauma on the scale of a foundational military disaster. For the Picts, it was presumably a triumph to be celebrated in exactly the kind of visual record that the Aberlemno stone may represent. Bride Mac Bail stands as perhaps the most politically accomplished of the Pictish kings that the sources allow us to see with any clarity. His management of the Northumbrian threat, his use of terrain and tactics, his ability to bring the various forces of Pictish territory together into a coherent military response at the moment it was needed, all of this suggests a king of considerable strategic intelligence. And yet he is essentially unknown outside of specialist circles. The Battle of Nectansmere appears in no standard British history curriculum, is commemorated by no public monument of significance, and is considered by the general population no more than an obscure footnote in the complex and poorly understood history of early medieval Scotland. The contrast with the fame of Alfred the Great, or William the Conqueror, or Robert the Bruce, all of whom operated in a tradition that left behind textual records managed by people with an interest in maintaining the memory of their deeds, is stark and revealing. The 8th century, which appears to have been in many respects the high point of Pictish civilization, is also the period that frustrates scholars most because the internal political record is most fragmentary. What the external sources, the Irish annals and the Northumbrian chronicles, tell us suggests a period of considerable political turbulence within Pictish territory, with multiple succession disputes and occasional external interventions, but also a period of economic and artistic flourishing that the archaeological record documents in its way. The symbol stones of the 8th century are often the most elaborate and artistically sophisticated of the entire corpus. The metalwork from this period is extraordinary. The monastery at Port Mahomac appears to have been at the height of its productive capacity in the 8th century. There is a dissonance between the political instability that the annals record and the artistic and economic vitality that the archaeology reveals, and making sense of that dissonance is one of the central challenges of Pictish scholarship. One possible resolution is that the Pictish political structure was more resilient than the succession disputes suggest, that the system for managing conflicts over the kingship was effective enough to prevent those conflicts from becoming destructive to the broader social and economic fabric, and that the artistic and monastic institutions operated with a degree of autonomy from the royal politics that allowed them to continue functioning even when the politics were turbulent. This is consistent with what we know about how early medieval monasteries operated in Ireland, where the monastic institutions maintained their functions through royal succession disputes and even through Viking raids, at least until the raids became severe enough to directly target the monasteries themselves. The king whose story most dramatically illustrates the 8th century situation is Oengus mac Fergusa, sometimes called Oengus I, who dominated Pictish politics from around 730 to 761 CE. Oengus was one of the most aggressive and politically ambitious Pictish kings the sources record, and his career illustrates both the heights that Pictish power could reach and the limits that constrained it. He suppressed competing Pictish dynasties, incorporated Dalriada into Pictish political control, fought campaigns against the Britons of Strathclyde and the Northumbrians, and seems to have consolidated a degree of Pictish dominance over northern Britain that had not been achieved before and would not be achieved again. By the middle of the 8th century, Oengus was arguably the most powerful king in Britain north of the Humber, but the dominance was personal and fragile. The system through which Oengus had built his power, the combination of military success, judicious marriage alliances, and the suppression of rival claimants, did not translate automatically into a stable institutional structure that would survive him. After his death in 761, the Pictish political situation became complicated again, with various successor kings holding power for shorter and shorter periods, and with the Dalriadan Scots reasserting their independence. The trajectory that Oengus had seemed to establish, of a dominant Pictish overking bringing all of northern Britain under a single political roof, reversed itself rapidly after his death. This volatility is one of the characteristic features of early medieval kingship across the British Isles and beyond. Power was intensely personal, intensely dependent on the particular capacities and the particular luck of the individual who held it. A great king could build a great kingdom and still be unable to create the institutional structures that would outlast him. The history of early medieval politics is full of such careers, of figures who achieved temporary dominance and then died, leaving successors who were unable to maintain what had been built. What makes the Pictish situation unusual is the degree to which the matrilineal succession system, by allowing a wider range of potential claimants to exercise plausible claims to kingship, may have made the volatility worse than it would otherwise have been. When any son of any woman of the royal line could potentially be a king, the pool of potential rivals for any sitting king is much larger than in a strictly patrilineal system, and the opportunities for factional conflict around succession multiply accordingly. The relationship between the Pictish kingship and the Pictish church was another dimension of the political situation that becomes increasingly important as the 8th century progresses. The church in Pictish territory was not simply a spiritual institution, it was an economic and political force of considerable significance, controlling lands, managing agricultural resources, providing literacy and administrative capacity, and participating in the networks of patronage and influence through which Pictish political life was organized. The relationship between the king and the church was not one of simple hierarchy in either direction. It was a negotiated relationship in which each needed what the other could provide, and in which the balance of power and influence was always being renegotiated. The major ecclesiastical sites in Pictish territory were patrons of the arts and centres of intellectual life, but they were also significant landowners and agricultural managers. The monastic economy that operated at sites like Portmahomac was not separate from the broader Pictish economy. It was embedded in it, drawing resources from the agricultural hinterland it controlled, providing services and goods to the aristocratic patrons who supported it, participating in the long-distance trade networks that brought in silver and glass and other luxury goods from outside Scotland. The relationship between the monastic economy and the royal economy was one of mutual dependence, and the disruption of that relationship by Viking raids and political instability was economically as well as culturally damaging. One of the most interesting questions in Pictish ecclesiastical history is the relationship between the Columban tradition, centred on Iona, and the more indigenous Pictish ecclesiastical tradition centred on sites like Portmahomac and Rosemarkie. This relationship was not always straightforward. Iona was the prestige institution of the Columban network, the mother house with the relics of Columba himself, and with a claim to ecclesiastical authority over the entire range of Columban daughter houses. But Iona was also an island off the west coast of Scotland, in the political territory of the Dalriadan Scots, rather than in Pictish territory proper. And its claims to authority in the Pictish East were always contested to some degree by the Pictish ecclesiastical tradition centred on its own sites. The Synod of Whitby in 664 CE, which resolved the difference between the Roman and Columban calculations of Easter in favour of the Roman tradition, was a Northumbrian event that had implications for the whole of the insular church. But its resolution of the Easter controversy in Northumbria did not immediately resolve it everywhere else. The Pictish Church continued for some time to follow the Columban Easter calculation, a technical liturgical matter that was also a marker of ecclesiastical allegiance, before eventually adopting the Roman calculation in the first decades of the 8th century. The transition, which appears to have been negotiated rather than simply imposed, is associated with the king Nectan mac Derail, who appears in Bede's account as having requested from the Northumbrian church both the correct Easter table and architectural assistance in building a stone church in the Roman style. Bede regards this as a straightforward submission of the Pictish church to Roman authority and Northumbrian expertise. The reality was almost certainly more complicated, involving a range of political and ecclesiastical calculations on Nectan's part that Bede's teleological narrative of the spread of Roman orthodoxy does not capture. The adoption of the Roman Easter was also associated with the expulsion of Columban monks from Pictish territory, at least temporarily, an event that the Irish annals record with a degree of hostility that reflects the Columban tradition's proprietary attitude toward its Pictish mission territory. This expulsion, whatever its precise nature and whatever motivated it, suggests that the Pictish church of the early 8th century was capable of asserting a degree of independence from the Columban network and of making autonomous decisions about its own ecclesiastical allegiance. It was not simply a colonial outpost of Iona. It was an institution with its own interests and its own capacity to act on them. All of this institutional complexity, the relationship between the Pictish king and the Pictish church, between the Columban tradition and the indigenous Pictish ecclesiastical tradition, between the Roman Easter and the Columban Easter, between the political ambitions of Oengus mac Fergusa and the ecclesiastical interests of the major Pictish monasteries, is the context within which the extraordinary artistic production of the 8th century took place. The great symbol stones of the Class II period, combining Pictish symbols with Christian iconography in ways that are visually extraordinary, emerge from this context of negotiation and complexity. They are not the product of a simple conversion story or a simple political history. They are the product of a civilization that was holding multiple things in tension simultaneously and managing that tension with considerable sophistication. And then the Viking raids began to change everything. The first recorded Viking raid on a Scottish monastery was the attack on Iona in 795 CE. This was not the last. Iona was attacked again in 802 and in 806, when 68 members of the community were killed in what the annals describe as the Massacre of Martyrs Bay. After the 806 attack, the community at Iona began the process of transferring its operations to a new monastery at Kells in Ireland, a decision that preserved the Columban tradition but that also effectively ended Iona's role as the dominant ecclesiastical institution of the northern British Isles. The physical transfer of resources from Iona to Kells included, almost certainly, manuscripts and relics, and other portable forms of institutional wealth, and among the things transferred was perhaps the beginnings of what became the Book of Kells, one of the greatest achievements of insular Christian art, which may have been produced at Iona before the raids made continued production there impossible. While Iona was being attacked from the west, the Pictish monasteries of the east were being attacked from the north and east. The Norse settlers who were establishing themselves in Orkney and Shetland in the late 8th and early 9th centuries used those islands as bases for raiding along the eastern and northern coasts of Scotland. Port Mahomac's destruction, which the excavation dates to the early 9th century, is likely part of this pattern of Norse raiding on the Pictish ecclesiastical sites of Easter Ross and the Moray coast. The site was wealthy enough and accessible enough by sea to be an attractive target, and once the raiding pattern was established, the institutional vulnerability of the major monasteries became clear. The response of the Pictish kingdom to the Viking threat in the early 9th century is not well documented. The fragmentary annalistic record suggests ongoing military conflict, but does not give us the kind of detailed strategic picture that would allow us to assess how the Pictish political system was responding to the challenge. What we can say is that the challenge was severe enough to strain whatever capacity for coordinated response the system possessed, and that the disaster of 839 CE suggests that the strain had become critical by that point. The Battle of 839, in which the Viking army destroyed the Pictish political elite, may have been the result of a Pictish miscalculation of the worst kind, an attempt to engage the Viking forces in a set-piece battle that played to Viking military strengths rather than to the ambush and terrain advantages that had served the Picts well against Northumbrian armies 2 centuries earlier. The Viking armies of the 9th century were experienced, mobile, and comfortable fighting in multiple environments. They were not armies that could be trapped in boggy ground by a clever Pictish general in the way that Egfrith's Northumbrians had been trapped at Nectansmere. They were armies that fought with a ferocity and a tactical flexibility that the Pictish military system, apparently, was not fully prepared for. After 839, the record of Pictish kings becomes confused and brief. The reigns get shorter. The names multiply in ways that suggest multiple competing claimants rather than a clear succession. The institutional capacity to manage royal succession in the traditional Pictish way, whatever that way precisely was, appears to have been severely damaged by the loss of so much of the aristocracy in a single engagement. Into this confused situation, Kenneth Mac Alpin arrived, and whatever combination of force and legitimacy and political maneuver he employed, he emerged as the king of both the Dalriadan Scots and the Pictish territory within a few years of the disaster. The nature of Kenneth's achievement is still debated. The traditional account, promoted by the kingdom he founded and maintained by later Scottish historiography, presents it as a unification, a bringing together of the two kingdoms of the north into a single, more powerful entity. The alternative account, preserved in fragments of tradition that the mainstream narrative had no interest in preserving, suggests something more violent: a conquest, a massacre, a deliberate elimination of the remaining Pictish aristocracy in order to clear the ground for Gaelic political dominance. The truth is probably somewhere between these poles, which in practice means that we do not know exactly what happened in the decade or so between 839 and the consolidation of Kenneth's power, and that the uncertainty is not resolvable with the evidence we have. What is not uncertain is the consequence. Within 2 or 3 generations of Kenneth's emergence as king, the kingdom of Alba was being governed in Gaelic, by kings with Gaelic names, in a church organised along Gaelic ecclesiastical lines. The Pictish king list, which had recorded the succession of overkings from at least the 5th century, stopped being continued. The Pictish name for the territory, Pictavia or its Pictish equivalent, was gradually replaced by Alba. The specific Pictish identity, whatever it had meant to the people who held it, ceased to be reproduced by the institutions that had maintained it. The people remained. This is the fundamental fact that gets lost in accounts of the Pictish disappearance that focus on political history rather than on the history of population. The farms were still being farmed by the descendants of the farmers who had farmed them in the Pictish period. The fishing settlements on the Moray coast were still inhabited by the descendants of the people who had fished there in the time of Bride Mac Melchon. The villages in Angus and Aberdeenshire and Easter Ross were still full of people whose grandparents had called themselves Picts, who had lived within the Pictish social system, who had perhaps understood the symbols on the stones in the local churchyard. But those grandchildren were now subjects of Alba, and their children after them would be Scots in a sense that would have no Pictish dimension, because the institutions that might have maintained the Pictish dimension were gone. The language shift from Pictish to Gaelic, which is the most concrete and measurable dimension of the cultural transformation, did not happen overnight. It happened over generations, driven by the prestige of Gaelic as the language of the court and the church and the emerging administrative apparatus of the kingdom, and by the practical advantages of speaking the prestige language in a world where prestige language determined access to power and opportunity. This is how language shifts work in all historical contexts. People do not stop speaking their mother tongue because they are told to. They stop speaking it because there are strong incentives to speak something else, and because the community structures that maintained the mother tongue cease to function effectively. In the case of Pictish, those community structures were the aristocratic households and the monasteries that had been the centres of Pictish culture, and they were either gone or transformed beyond recognition by the 9th century catastrophes. The Gaelic language that replaced Pictish was itself being transformed by the encounter, incorporating Pictish vocabulary and phonological features in ways that gave Scottish Gaelic its distinctive character compared to the Irish Gaelic from which it derived. The influence of Pictish on Scottish Gaelic is a subject of ongoing research, and the specific extent to which Pictish contributed to the development of the distinctly Scottish character of the Gaelic spoken in Scotland is still being debated. But the broad point is clear. The language shift was not a simple replacement but a fusion, with the incoming prestige language being modified by the languages it was replacing in ways that leave traces in the resulting linguistic product. This pattern of incoming cultural forms being modified by the indigenous forms they encounter is characteristic of the whole process of Pictish transformation into Scottish. The kingdom of Alba was not simply a Gaelic kingdom transplanted to Scottish soil. It was a kingdom shaped by the encounter between Gaelic political culture and Pictish social reality, and the result was something that was neither simply Gaelic nor simply Pictish, but a genuinely new synthesis. The Scottish identity that emerged in the high medieval period, the identity that eventually produced the kingdom that fought and won independence at Bannockburn and that eventually became the Scotland of today, was built on a foundation that included both the Gaelic dimension that the founding mythology of the kingdom emphasized and the Pictish dimension that the founding mythology largely obscured. Understanding this properly is not simply an academic matter. It is a matter of historical honesty about the origins and the complexity of a national identity that remains politically significant today. The question of what Scotland is and where it comes from, and who its people are cannot be fully answered without acknowledging the Pictish contribution to the answer, and the particular way in which that contribution was managed out of the mainstream narrative by the kingdom that replaced the Pictish one tells us something important about how national narratives work and what they leave out. Every national narrative simplifies. Every founding mythology emphasizes some ancestors and obscures others. This is not unique to Scotland or to the early Scottish kingdom. It is a characteristic of every historical polity that has tried to construct a coherent identity from a diverse and complicated past. But the specific simplification that occurred with the Picts, the degree to which a sophisticated and distinctive civilization was reduced to a curiosity or a mystery rather than acknowledged as a direct ancestor, is worth understanding on its own terms. And the tools we now have, archaeological and genetic and linguistic, to see past that simplification and to recover something of the Pictish reality underneath the Scottish mythology, are among the most valuable intellectual resources that the study of Scottish history currently possesses. There is a contemporary relevance here that goes beyond the academic. In a period when questions of national identity, historical continuity, and the relationship between past and present are politically charged in Scotland as in many places, the Picts offer a particular kind of corrective. They demonstrate that the past is always more complicated than any current political narrative requires it to be. They demonstrate that the processes by which some voices get preserved and others get lost are not natural or inevitable, but are the products of power and institutional capacity operating in specific historical circumstances. They demonstrate that the people of a place and the cultural identity of a place are not the same thing, and that a change in cultural identity does not necessarily mean a change in the people who inhabit the land. These are not comfortable lessons. Comfortable lessons tend to be wrong ones, but they are honest lessons, and they are the lessons that the Pictish evidence, taken seriously on its own terms, teaches. The carved stone in the field is still speaking. The place names are still carrying their encoded geography. The genes are still circulating in the bodies of the people who live in the land that was once Pictland. And the mystery, the genuine historical mystery of what happened to the institutional life of the Picts and how the silence was made, is still worth sitting with, because it is the kind of mystery that rewards sustained attention rather than quick answers. There is something about the particular quality of Pictish evidence, the way it is simultaneously so present and so opaque, that makes it peculiarly appropriate to the larger question of what it means to try to know the past. We have the stones. We cannot read them. We have the place names. We cannot fully recover the system of meaning that produced them. We have the DNA. We cannot hear in it the specific experiences and the specific choices of the people who lived those lives. What we have, always and only, is the trace. The mark in the stone that says something was here, that something was trying to communicate, that something valued permanence enough to invest in it. And from those traces we build, imperfectly and incompletely, a picture that is not the thing itself, but is the best we can do with the distance that time puts between us and the people we are trying to understand. This is the condition of all historical knowledge, not just of Pictish history. We are always working from traces. The difference with the Picts is that the traces are so eloquent, and the context that would make them fully interpretable is so thoroughly lost that the gap between what we have and what we need is unusually visible. That visibility is, paradoxically, one of the most useful things about Pictish history for anyone who wants to understand how historical knowledge works and what its limits are. The Picts make the epistemological situation of the historian visible in a way that more fully documented civilizations do not. And in making that situation visible, they remind us of something that is easy to forget when the sources are abundant and the narrative seems clear. Historical knowledge is always partial, always mediated, always the product of the specific institutional arrangements that determined which things got preserved and which did not. The Pictish silence is an extreme version of a situation that is actually universal. Every historical record is a selection. Every archive reflects the priorities of whoever maintained it. Every narrative of the past serves some purpose in the present, even when that purpose is no longer visible because enough time has passed to make the original context of production opaque. The Picts remind us to ask, always, whose silence are we in? whose voice is missing from the account we think we understand. Who was there? Who made things and lived lives and had things worth saying? Whose trace in the record has been managed into invisibility by forces that were interested in their absence rather than their presence? Those questions have no final answers, but they are the right questions to be asking. And the Picts, in their 1200 years of silence, are one of history's most eloquent arguments for why we need to keep asking them. And perhaps that is the thought to carry into sleep tonight. Not the resolved answer to the Pictish mystery, because there is no resolved answer, but the awareness that behind every silence in history there is a human voice that was silenced, and that the effort to hear something in that silence, however imperfect and incomplete, is an act of respect for the full complexity of the human past. The Picts were there. They built things and thought things and organized their lives according to principles we only partially understand. They tried, with everything they had, to leave something behind that would tell the people who came after that they had been real. They succeeded. The stones are there. You are here. And somewhere in the distance between the stone and the person standing before it, the thing that was lost is still almost present, still almost speakable, still almost findable if we look carefully enough and listen with the right kind of attention. The night is long, and the mystery is quiet, and the stones have been waiting patiently for a very long time. Somewhere in the landscape of eastern Scotland, as the last light fades from the carved symbols on the stone in the field, something settles into the ground the way it settles every evening, the way it has been settling every evening for 12 centuries. Not a ghost, not a presence in any supernatural sense, but the weight of the human investment that was made here, the labor and the skill and the intention, still present in the physical object, even though the meaning it encoded is almost entirely lost. The stone is heavy because the people who raised it wanted it to be permanent, because they knew that what they were making would outlast them and that the lasting was the point. They were right about that. The stone has lasted. You are here, at the end of a long exploration of what the Picts were and what happened to them and why the silence is so complete. And the stone is still standing in the field or in the museum or in the churchyard, still carved with its symbols, still carrying the message that no one alive can read. The lasting is complete. The message is not, but the lasting is. If you are listening in the dark, if the mystery of the Picts has kept you company in the quiet hours and given your mind something to move through as your body moves towards sleep, then the purpose of this exploration has been served. History is not only for the daytime, it is also for these hours, when the details of your own day have receded far enough to allow something larger to enter, when the mind is loose enough to wander through the centuries without needing to resolve everything into a clear and usable conclusion. The Picts do not resolve. They remain. In the stones and the names and the genes and the mystery, they remain as one of history's most eloquent refusals to be fully incorporated into somebody else's narrative. The kingdom of Alba tried to make them into prehistory. 12 centuries of subsequent history have tried to turn them into a romantic mystery, and the stones have simply stood there, declining to be either, declining to be anything other than what they are, which is the physical evidence of a real civilization that valued permanence and invested in it, and was vindicated by the fact that the investment has lasted. The Picts are still here, in the only way that any of the past is still here, in its traces, in its marks on the world, in the ongoing consequences of its existence for everything that came after it. You are one of the things that came after. The land you are sleeping in, or the land you are thinking about while you listen, is also one of the things that came after. The mystery that has kept you company tonight is not a dead mystery. It is a living one, being actively pursued by researchers and archaeologists and linguists and geneticists who are adding to the picture with every new excavation and every new analysis. The story is not over. It is ongoing. And when morning comes and the world resumes its pace and the Picts recede back into the historical background where most of us carry them most of the time, they will still be there, in the stones and the names and the ground, waiting for the next person to stop and pay attention and ask what the symbol means and why the silence is so complete and whether there is a way to hear, across all the centuries of absence, the voice that was silenced before it could say everything it had to say. There is something deeply human about that kind of listening, about the willingness to stand before something that cannot be fully understood and to keep paying attention anyway, because the thing that cannot be fully understood is real and was made by people who deserved better than the silence they got. The Picts deserved better. They knew it. The stones are the evidence that they knew it, that they tried their hardest to leave something that would last, that would demand attention, that would not let the world simply move on without pausing to notice that something had been here. Something had been here. Something remarkable. Something that we are still only beginning to understand. Rest now. The stones are still standing. The mystery is still open. And the long, patient, unfinished work of listening to what the Picts are trying to tell us will continue when the light comes back. Good night from wherever you are, and whatever hour it is there, and whatever darkness you are resting in. The symbols on the stone are speaking in the dark, the same way they speak in the light, steadily and without urgency, to anyone who is willing to stop and listen. You stopped. You listened. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything that the people who made the stones were hoping for. Sleep well. The mystery endures. And so, in the only way that matters, do the Picts. There is one more dimension of the Pictish world that deserves sustained attention before we let the mystery settle back into the landscape where it lives. It is the dimension of the Pictish relationship with the Norse, not simply as a story of victimhood and destruction, because the Picts were not simply victims, but as a story of encounter and adaptation, and the complex ways in which one civilization responds when a radically different kind of force arrives in its world, without warning, and begins reshaping the conditions of existence. The Norse arrival in the waters around Scotland was not a single event. It was a gradual intensification of presence that began with trading contacts and raiding in the late 8th century and deepened over the course of the 9th into permanent settlement in the Northern Isles, the Western Isles, and eventually along parts of the northern and western mainland. The Pictish response to this intensification had to be improvised because the Picts had no prior experience of this kind of threat and no institutional memory of how to deal with it. The Northumbrians, whom the Picts had fought and defeated and negotiated with for generations, were a recognizable kind of political entity, a kingdom with a king and a court and a church and a set of diplomatic conventions within which the Picts could operate. The Norse were different. Organized not around a single kingdom, but around networks of chieftains and war leaders whose movements were fluid, whose political structures were decentralized, and whose appetite for the kind of wealth that monasteries and trading settlements concentrated made the major Pictish centers of economic and ecclesiastical life precisely the targets most vulnerable to their attention. The monastic sites were not simply places of prayer. They were, as we have noted, major concentrations of movable wealth, silver and glass and vellum, and the labor of skilled craftsmen, all in one place, accessible by sea, typically not defended by the kind of military infrastructure that would deter a determined raid. The economics of the situation was straightforward. A Norse raiding party that could reach Port Mahomac on a summer morning could carry away more wealth in a few hours than they could acquire through months of other activity, and the probability of organized military resistance was low enough to make the raid worthwhile. The Pictish kingdom's response to this situation was constrained by geography and by the nature of Pictish military organization. The Pictish military system, like that of most early medieval kingdoms, was organized around the obligation of the aristocracy and their dependence to provide military service to the king when required. This system worked well for campaigns and set-piece battles. It worked less well for the kind of rapid response that Viking raiding required, where the speed of the attack was itself part of the military strategy. By the time a Pictish king could mobilize forces to respond to a raid on a coastal monastery, the raiders were gone, their ships already pulling away from the shore with whatever they had taken. The structural mismatch between the Pictish military system and the Viking threat is one of the factors that made the 9th century so devastating for the Pictish world. It was not simply that the Vikings were more powerful warriors, though they were formidable fighters. It was that their tactical approach, fast maritime strikes against high-value undefended targets, was specifically suited to defeating the kind of defense that an early medieval agricultural kingdom organized around military obligation could mount. The Picts were trying to fight a 20th century problem with 5th century tools, except the disproportion was even more fundamental than that metaphor suggests. The Norse settlements in Orkney and Shetland, which appear to have been established in the late 8th or early 9th century, replaced a Pictish population that had been in the Northern Isles for centuries. The nature of this replacement, whether it was violent displacement or gradual assimilation or some combination of the two, is one of the questions that the archaeological and genetic evidence is still working to answer. What the archaeology of the Northern Isles shows is a transition from a Pictish material culture to a Norse material culture in the sites of the early 9th century, with very little evidence of the kind of transitional mixed material culture that you would expect to see if the two populations had coexisted and interacted closely for a significant period before one replaced the other. This suggests that the transition was relatively rapid, which is consistent with violent displacement, but also consistent with a situation in which a small existing population was overwhelmed demographically by a much larger incoming group. The DNA evidence from Orkney is interesting in this context. The modern population of Orkney carries a very high proportion of Norse genetic ancestry, higher than almost anywhere else in Britain outside of parts of Iceland and the Faroe Islands, which suggests that the Norse settlement of Orkney was a substantial demographic event that genuinely replaced much of the existing population rather than simply adding a Norse elite on top of a Pictish base. Whether this replacement was through violence or through the demographic consequences of Norse settlement, displacing or absorbing a smaller existing population is not something the genetics alone can determine. But the degree of Norse genetic dominance in the modern Orcadian population does suggest that whatever Pictish population had been in the Northern Isles before the Norse arrival did not survive in significant numbers as a distinct community. The situation was different on the mainland, where the Norse settlements were more limited and the existing Pictish population was much larger and much more deeply embedded in the agricultural and social landscape. In Easter, Ross and Caithness and Sutherland, Norse settlement was real and left genetic traces, but the existing population was not replaced to anything like the degree it was in Orkney. Instead, the Norse settlers became part of a mixed community in which Pictish-derived and Norse-derived elements coexisted and eventually merged into the communities that became recognizably Scottish in the High Medieval period. This geographic variation in the nature and the intensity of Norse settlement is important for understanding the Pictish response to the Norse presence. In the Northern Isles, the Pictish world was effectively ended by the Norse arrival, and whatever institutional continuity the Pictish system had maintained, there was broken. On the mainland, the situation was more complex, with a Norwegian presence in the north and west that was real, but that did not eliminate the existing social order in the way it had in Orkney. The mainland Pictish political system had to manage the Norse presence rather than simply succumbing to it, and the ways in which it attempted that management are part of the story of the 9th century that the fragmentary record does not allow us to reconstruct in any detail. What the record does show is that the combined pressure of Norse raiding on the eastern and northern coasts and Norse settlement in the north and west, together with the internal political instability that followed the disaster of 839 CE, created a situation of extraordinary difficulty for any Pictish political leader trying to maintain the coherence and the institutional life of the kingdom. The problems were compounding each other. Viking raids reduced the economic capacity of the monastic centres that were part of the backbone of Pictish institutional life. The destruction of the aristocracy in 839 reduced the political capacity for coordinated response. The resulting instability created opportunities for external actors, including Kenneth Mac Alpin and the Dalriadan Scots, to assert themselves in ways that the Pictish system would previously have had the resilience to resist. The tragedy, if we want to call it that, is not simply that the Vikings attacked the Picts. The tragedy is the compound nature of the catastrophe, the way in which each element of the crisis made the others worse, the way in which a civilization that had shown extraordinary resilience and sophistication for 5 centuries was unable to recover from the specific combination of external pressure and internal disruption that the 9th century brought. Different timing, different luck, a different trajectory for the Norse expansion, and the Pictish world might have survived, might have adapted as other early medieval kingdoms adapted to the Viking challenge, might have produced the textual record that would have allowed us to understand it on its own terms. But that is not what happened. What happened is what we have been tracing throughout this exploration. A cascade of institutional failures, each making the next more likely. until the specific cultural and political infrastructure that maintained Pictish identity was too damaged to reproduce itself, and the people who had been Picts found themselves in a new political world organized by different principles and speaking a different prestige language. And gradually, over the course of 2 or 3 generations, the identity that had been theirs for half a millennium became a memory, and then the memory became a mystery. And the mystery has been waiting, in the stones and the place names and the genes, for whoever came after to notice it and to wonder what it means. You noticed, you wondered. That is not a small thing. In the economy of historical attention, where so much is forgotten and so little is remembered, the Picts wanted to be remembered. In this particular moment, listening in whatever darkness you are giving them that, not the full remembrance they deserved and that they tried to engineer through the stones, but something, a pause in the general forgetting, a space in which the mystery of what they were and what happened to them is held with the seriousness and the humility that it deserves. The carved stone in the field does not know you are listening. It has no way of knowing. But the people who raised it, who invested their skill and their time and their understanding of what permanence means in the act of making it, they were trying to reach across time to exactly this moment, to someone standing or lying in the dark, paying attention to a voice they cannot quite hear, but cannot quite ignore either. You cannot quite ignore it either. That is why you are still here. At the end of a long night of exploration, at the end of a mystery that has no final answer but that has given you something, some small piece of the Pictish world that you did not have before, some sense of the specific quality of what was lost and how it was lost and why that loss matters in the ongoing human project of trying to understand where we come from and what the people who came before us were doing with their time. They were doing everything we do. They were loving their families and managing their fields and arguing about politics and worrying about the harvest and trying to make things that would last. They were human, completely and entirely human, in ways that the mystery of their disappearance sometimes obscures. They were not supernatural. They were not aliens. They were not the carriers of some occult bloodline or the survivors of some lost civilization. They were people, living in the north of Britain in the early centuries of the first millennium CE, doing the things that people do and making the most of the specific circumstances in which they found themselves. And the most extraordinary thing they did, in a sense, is the thing they did most quietly. They raised the stones, not to impress future generations with mystery, not to encode secrets that only the initiated could decode, but simply to say, in the clearest language they had, which happened to be a language we cannot read, that they were here and that what they were was worth recording and that the people who came after should know that something specific and real had existed in this place. They were right. Something specific and real did exist. And the people who came after, including you, now know it, however incompletely, however imperfectly, however far short of what the stones were trying to say, our understanding necessarily falls. The night is ending, or it is not ending, depending on where you are and what time it is there. The mystery of the Picts is not ending. It is ongoing, and it will be ongoing for as long as there are people curious enough to stop in front of a carved stone and ask what it means. That curiosity is one of the most reliably human things there is. It is the same curiosity that drove the Pictish artists to develop their symbol system, to carve it on 300 stones across centuries of Scottish landscape, to make it permanent in the belief that permanence would attract attention and that attention would eventually, somehow, lead to understanding. They were more right than they knew. The attention has been constant, even if the understanding has lagged behind. The stones have not been ignored. They have been puzzled over and argued about and photographed and measured and analysed, first by antiquarians with notebooks and then by archaeologists with trowels and now by scientists with lasers and algorithms. The attention has never stopped. What has stopped, repeatedly, is the progress of understanding, because the evidence base is so thin and the interpretive context so thoroughly lost that even the most sophisticated analysis can only go so far before it reaches the boundary of what can be known. But the boundary keeps moving. It has moved enormously in the past few decades as new tools and new methods and new datasets have added to the picture. And it will keep moving as the archaeologists keep digging and the geneticists keep analyzing, and the linguists keep arguing, and the art historians keep looking more carefully at the details of the carving. The mystery of the Picts is not static. It is a moving target, becoming a little less mysterious with each new excavation and each new analysis, while always remaining more mysterious than anyone would wish, more resistant to resolution than the evidence seems to promise. That resistance is itself a kind of integrity. The Picts will not be resolved on our terms. They will only be understood, partially and imperfectly, on their own terms, which requires us to look carefully at what they actually left behind, rather than at what we wish they had left behind, and to stay close to the evidence, rather than letting the void invite the projections that human beings always want to make into any sufficiently large and dark unknown. Stay close to the evidence. Ask the honest questions. Hold the uncertainty with the patience it deserves. And when morning comes and the ordinary demands of the day reassert themselves, carry a little of the Pictish mystery with you into the world. Not as an answer, because there is no final answer, but as a reminder that the world is older and more complex and more human than any single account of it can capture, and that the people who came before us were doing things that deserved to be remembered, even when the record that should have preserved them was lost. The Picts deserve better than the silence they got. In this small and imperfect way, in the hours that this exploration has taken, they have received something other than silence. They have received attention, which is the thing they were asking for all along. The carved symbol is still there in the stone. The night is still quiet. And wherever you are, in whatever darkness you are resting in, the long human chain that connects the person who raised that stone to the person listening now is still unbroken, because it was never a chain of names or languages or political identities. It was always a chain of attention and curiosity and the deeply human desire to know who was here before us and what they were doing, and whether they too watched the Moray Firth turn silver in autumn and felt, for a moment, that the world was exactly as large and as beautiful and as full of mystery as it needed to be. They did. Of course they did. They were people. And so, in this quiet hour, are you. Sleep well. The stones are standing. The mystery is open. And the Picts, in whatever sense the dead can be said to be anything at all, are perhaps a little more remembered than they were when the night began. There is a particular quality of light in the Pictish landscape that no other light in the world quite replicates. The low angle of the northern sun, especially in the long summer evenings and the brief, brilliant winter days, turns the carved surfaces of the symbol stones in ways that reveal details invisible at other times and in other light. The incised lines catch shadow. The relief carving on the Class II stones throws shapes onto itself. The symbols seem, at certain hours, to breathe, to shift slightly as the light moves across them, to be engaged in some slow conversation with the sky that the stone itself participates in rather than simply recording. The Pictish artists knew this. They chose their stones partly for the way the stone surface would interact with northern light. They oriented their carvings to work in the specific conditions of the specific locations where the stones were raised. This is not something you can see in a museum, where the stones are lit from above in controlled indoor light designed for visibility rather than for the particular quality of encounter that the outdoor setting provided. To understand a Pictish stone fully, you need to see it in the landscape where it was raised, at different times of day, in different seasons, in the specific light conditions of the specific place where it stands. This is one more thing the Pictish disappearance from the record took from us. Not just the interpretive tradition that would have told us what the symbols meant, but the embodied, situated, time-sensitive knowledge of how to experience the stones the way their makers intended them to be experienced. The archaeology recovers the object. It cannot fully recover the experience of the object in its original context. That experience was part of what the Picts were communicating, and it is irretrievably lost except in the moments when someone stands in the right field at the right hour and feels, even without understanding, the full weight of what was made here. Those moments still happen. They will continue to happen as long as the stones stand and people come to look at them. And in those moments of uncomprehending but genuine attention, something of the Pictish intention is fulfilled, however partially. The stones were made to be looked at. They are still being looked at. That continuity of attention, across all the centuries of silence and mystery and failed interpretation, is perhaps the most honest monument to the Picts that exists. And as you drift towards sleep now, Carrying the mystery of the Picts with you into whatever dreams the darkness brings, carry also the image of that light, the northern light, falling at a low angle across a carved stone in a Scottish field, the symbols catching shadow, the stone breathing, the long, patient 12th century silence still full of something that was trying to be said, still asking for the attention that might one day, in some small and imperfect way, become understanding. The Picts asked for that attention. You gave it. That is enough. The light fades from the stone. The night settles over the landscape. The mystery endures. And you, listening in the dark, are part of the long chain of human attention that connects the maker to the observer, the carver to the watcher, the silence to the listening. That chain is unbroken. It is enough. The Picts asked to be remembered. In this hour, you remembered them. Sleep well. The stones are standing. Good night.